These faces you're looking at are the people behind some of the most infamous true crime cases covered on this channel. In this Twisted Minds compilation video, we'll be exploring each and every one of their cases, proving that evil is not defined by location. It does certainly not have an age limit. This brings us to our first case, the murder of Erica Green. The story we're going to explore today sparked nationwide interest across the United States as the victim remained unidentified for several years. As long as the case remained unsolved, it was constantly discussed in the media. Imagine taking a walk in a park and finding a dead body. Not just a dead body, but the body of a small child, headless and mutilated beyond recognition. This happened in Hibbs Park at 59th Street in Kensington Avenue in Kansas City, Missouri. This story is about the murder of Erica Green, a 3-year-old American girl. What were the motivations? And what could be done in the future to prevent such crimes? What you will find out in today's video will shock you to the core. It was April 28th, 2001, when the naked, decapitated body of little Erica Green was found in a wooded area in the city, close to a church. The body was covered with bruises and injuries, as if someone had repeatedly kicked it. Initially, it was estimated that the body belonged to a 3 to 6-year-old child. Almost 3 days later, her head was found wrapped in a plastic bag 150 to 200 yards away from the body discovery site. The initial report suggested that the body had bruises that may have been caused by constant kicking or hitting with a heavy object such as an ashtray. Judging by the nature of the cuts on the neck, it was presumed that the head was chopped off using shears or hedge clippers. The police tried to figure out the person's identity, but were unsuccessful. There were no reports of a small black girl missing in the surrounding areas. After nobody came forward to claim the girl's body, the story caught the media's attention. She was referred to as Precious Doe. Several volunteers came forward to raise funds for Erica's funeral, which was held in December of 2001. The funeral was attended by hundreds of people. A memorial was also built in Hibbs Park, near where Erica's body was found. Many attempts were made to identify the little girl. This included forensic facial recognition techniques, such as police sketches, computer-generated images, and face busts. The investigators narrowed down her age to between 3 and 4 years old. Due to the increased pressure from the public, the body of Erica Green was exhumed 2 times for autopsy purposes. Once in 2002 and again in 2003. Despite receiving thousands of tips from around the world and putting a lot of effort into the investigation, they were unsuccessful. One of the activists, Alonzo Washington, never gave up. He kept talking about the case and ensured the investigation never stopped. Every year on the anniversary of Erica's death, he ran an ad in a local African-American newspaper, the Kansas City Call, to remind people of the incident. To encourage people to come forward, he raised $33,000 for reward money in the case. On April 30th, 2005, Alonzo was contacted by a man named Thurman McIntosh. He claimed to be the grandfather of a man named Harold Johnson, who lived in Muskogee, Oklahoma. According to Thurman, Harold moved to Kansas City in the spring of 2001 after marrying a woman named Michelle Green. She already had a daughter named Erica Green. When the family moved back to Oklahoma, Erica wasn't with them. Upon being asked about Erica, Michelle always struggled to answer the questions. That led Thurman to believe that Erica was actually Precious Doe. On the 4th of May, Thurman was questioned after Alonzo forwarded the tip to a Kansas City homicide detective. Fortunately, Thurman was able to provide the investigators with a hair strand belonging to Michelle. The DNA from the hair was a match to Precious Doe's DNA. The police instantly traced the Johnsons and brought them in for questioning. And not long after that, the mystery started to be revealed. On May 5th, 2005, it was announced that Precious Doe was indeed Erica Green. The innocent Precious Doe was born on May 15th, 1997 in McLeod, Oklahoma. Just a month before Erica was born, Michelle was in prison for larceny. The Mabel Bassett Correctional Center didn't allow children to live with inmates, so she gave Erica to Betty Brown, a friend of her grandmother. Very little is known about who Betty was. On April 4th, 2001, Michelle picked up Erica from Betty's place. She said they were going to have a family reunion. Instead, she moved to Kansas City, Missouri with her boyfriend, Harold Johnson. Initially, Michelle wanted to get a job in Kansas City, but after multiple failed attempts, she lost her faith, got depressed, and started using drugs. In late April 2001, the Johnsons were living in Kansas City. By then, both husband and wife were using PCP, a drug that can cause disordered thinking and delusions. One night when Erica didn't want to go to bed, Harold got angry and started kicking her. That's when Erica became unconscious and passed out. Upon finding Erica, Michelle tried to revive her but was unsuccessful. Considering that they both had outstanding warrants for their arrest, they were afraid to seek professional medical help. Michelle placed Erica's body in a bathtub full of ice cold water in the hope that she'd regain consciousness. It was estimated that Erica was unconscious for between 10 hours and 2 days before she died. After the death, the couple hid Erica's body in a baby stroller. Hiding the little girl's body was now the only option for the couple. Harold and Michelle showed absolutely no remorse in disposing of her body. To make things worse, they decided to chop off her head with hedge clippers so that no one would recognize her. Upon reaching the park, they removed her clothes and cut off her head. Only a pair of monsters could do this to an innocent little soul. They threw the head away from where her body was. At that point, Harold and Michelle thought that no one would ever find her. They moved on with their lives as if nothing had ever happened. Every now and then, relatives asked about Erica's whereabouts. Michelle used to tell people that Erica was back with Betty Brown in Oklahoma. She kept telling similar lies for the next 4 years. Erica was never reported missing because her mom always came up with excuses. It was later provided by LaWanda Driscoll, Harold's cousin, that Michelle too was involved in disposing of the body. Once Erica was dead, she put the body in the stroller as if she was asleep and transported her. LaWanda was also present in the home on the day Erica was killed. We could hear screaming in the back bedroom. When talking to a local news channel, LaWanda also provided more information about Erica. According to her, Erica was never happy at Harold's place. She was homesick and cried a lot. Harold Johnson would beat the child for crying, for peeing on herself, if she wouldn't eat, whatever. She even heard Harold tell Michelle, "You'd better go take care of your daughter, or I'm going to do something bad." Once Erica went missing, LaWanda and her cousin often used to ask about her, but Michelle Johnson always had an excuse for everything, and we believed her at the time. The story was now out. Erica Green was indeed murdered, decapitated, thrown in a park by her own parents. The Johnsons were charged with second-degree felony murder on May 5th, 2005. They were extradited to Kansas City. Harold Johnson was convicted of first-degree murder in the death of his stepdaughter. In September 2007, Michelle pled guilty to the second-degree murder charge after she testified against Harold. Eventually, she was sentenced to 25 years in prison on different charges. This included endangering the welfare of a child, murder, abandoning a corpse, and tampering with physical evidence. Upon hearing that Michelle had recorded a testimony against her husband, things got heated between Harold and Michelle, and they both started blaming each other for the murder. According to Harold, Michelle was a bad mother who never cared for Erica. She used to get high on drugs and left Erica alone for hours. In an extreme burst of anger, he told Michelle, "I hope you got run over." The cause of death was reported as closed head injury. Harold ultimately confessed to the crimes and agreed that little Erica was kicked in the head. According to a neurosurgeon, Erica's life could have been saved if she had gotten professional medical help immediately. In November, Harold was sentenced to life in prison without parole. Up next is the story of Fidel Lopez, the maniac who gutted his girlfriend in a drunken rage. Maria Nemeth's case is one of the many classic homicide cases rife in the United States. The country has a well-documented history of violence compared to other developed nations. It's astounding how many people continue to believe the United States facade as a saint's nest or God's own country. Instead, it's a place where deviant, violent cultures are encouraged through media, legislation, privilege, and freedom. This brings us to the sad and gory details of Maria Nemeth's homicide. It's time to play our game of whodunit and why. To her neighbors, Maria Nemeth was amongst the sweetest, kindest people they had ever met. She was well loved and had a great reputation. According to Dan Carter, Nemeth was very gentle, very private, soft-spoken young lady. We all loved her. Very pleasant young lady. Another neighbor, Debbie Katz, also backed up this sentiment, who described the deceased as a very sweet, loving girl. Been here for years. I've been in and out of the office for 8 years. Before her demise, Nemeth was employed as a leasing agent for an apartment complex. She met Fidel Lopez at a club during that time, and the two fell in love. Nemeth was a Peruvian native who moved to the United States in her teenage years, settling in Miami-Dade County, South Florida. She took up several jobs over the years, including office and retail gigs. Fidel Lopez, on the other hand, hails from Havana, Cuba. He left his hometown for the United States when he was only 15 or 16 to join his father, who was already in the country. At the time of his arrest, Lopez worked at the 595 truck stop on 2705 Burris Road, Davie, Florida. When the business was contacted, the manager stressed that Lopez was a temporary hire with a few days on his contract. Broward court records revealed that Nemeth had left a marriage previously, which, unfortunately, was a factor in her death. In April 2007, she tied the knot with a man named Norbert in a religious ceremony held in Boca Raton. They were married for 8 years before splitting up. However, they weren't officially divorced, merely separated. So, when news of Nemeth's death reached Norbert, he declined to comment, but implied that he or the deceased family might make a statement eventually. Maria's new relationship with Lopez was only 1 year in when tragedy struck. At the time of their meeting, he had 2 kids and he was living with their mother. As the relationship grew over time and became more serious, Nemeth and Lopez decided to move in together. First, they found a place in Hollywood. Then, they relocated to Hialeah to put up with Lopez's family as they searched for a new place. In a twisted turn of fate, they found and paid for a place at Colonnade Residences in Sunrise. Nemeth was the leading manager of the apartment complex, so they easily moved in. Then, a week into their stay at the new place, Lopez returned home from the truck stop to Nemeth, who'd done some cooking. The couple had rice, chicken, and beans for dinner before driving up to Hialeah to meet and spend time with Fidel's mother. Lopez recounted that he took Nemeth to a Chili's restaurant the same night, where they ordered some margaritas before making another stop at ABC Fine Wine and Spirits. There, he got them a bottle of tequila, which they took back to their house in Sunrise. Since they were fairly new in the apartment, the couple hadn't got around to getting furniture, so they made a makeshift table using several cardboard boxes. The same night, they did some tequila shots, even cutting some limes and garnishing with salt. All the while, they blasted some music on a cell phone and downed half the bottle. All seemed to be going well until it was not. Lopez caught a blinding rage that saw the sliding glass door and closet door torn down, while the drywall took several punches that left holes in it. Lopez claimed that he was too stoned to remember what sent him on a hulking spree in the first place, but he did remember that he and Nemeth had had the roughest sex inside the closet. In their drunken haze, the couple wound up in the bathroom because Maria Nemeth felt nauseous. I just remembered seeing glass on the floor. I really don't remember when I broke it or why did I break it, Lopez reported to investigators. He claimed to have stepped out almost immediately for a smoke, but returned to find Nemeth barely breathing on the bathroom floor. A decent argument if the deceased wasn't found with her vaginal canal sprawled out all over the floor. Oh, with the intestines completely torn out of her body. Yeah, things are about to take a turn for the worst. It's 3:39 a.m. when the 911 line buzzes. An operator jumps on the call to hear a frightened Lopez whimpering at the other end of the line. "She's not breathing. She's not breathing," he cried. "She's gonna die. She's not breathing. Send the ambulance."
I don't know when she went to the bathroom, or when I went there, it was full blood and everything, I don't know, man, she's not breathing. I mean, she's gonna die, man. Come on, son.
A couple minutes later, the Sunrise Police Department had flooded around the Colonnade residence. They made their way to the couple's apartment, where they found Lopez wailing over Nemeth's nude body in the bathroom. Blood had puddled near the corpse, and body tissue stretched from the deceased's nether region. A crying man rang 911, and a dead woman, turned inside out, seemed like something out of the illegal abortion handbook. Or so the detectives thought, until they tried to get Lopez's statement. His account and the disarray of the apartment told a different story though. Bloodstains were all over the apartment, not just the bathroom, bedroom, closet, doors, and walls. The broken sliding glass and the door torn clean off its hinges further spurred suspicion of foul play. Some 30 minutes into their arrival, Nemeth was pronounced dead by the Sunrise Fire Rescue Department. Detectives searched for clues around the house and happened on the half-empty bottle of tequila that started the night and slices of lime and several indications of a scuffle. Upon reaching out to the neighbors, two claimed to have heard a lot of noise, with a man yelling at the top of his voice for about 2 hours before all went quiet. Lopez was brought in for questioning the following day, a Sunday morning, to recount his side of the story. He began by revealing their sex ramp in the closet before Nemeth made her way to the bathroom, where she was subsequently puking and collapsed. When asked about foreign objects in her body, Lopez clarified that Nemeth had talked him into trying beer bottles as an adult toy. Surely no woman in the history of sexual encounters has ever urged a guy to take out his phallus and instead stuff her with bottles? Well, let's just see how this holds up in court. Fortunately, the detectives didn't buy the story and pressed Lopez for more details. Instead, he finally caved and described in gory detail how he snapped and murdered his girlfriend of 1 year. All seemed to be going fine when they were making love until Nemeth made the murder-worthy error of calling out her ex-husband's name twice. Lopez flew into a rage. "She changed my name," he told detectives. "That's not really how the change of names works, but okay. She called me the name of the other guy, and she said it twice, and she was wrong, and she was confusing me with him." According to Lopez, he stepped out of the closet and began breaking things around the house. The rear sliding door was his first victim, followed by the drywall and the closet door because, the house is to blame. Upon returning to the closet, he found that Nemeth had collapsed and was unconscious. Horrifically, Lopez grabbed some beer bottles and began inserting them up Nemeth's vagina. Not looking quite as stuffed as he was hoping for, Lopez went ahead and added a flat iron for hair. Just to make sure everything was in the right place, he rammed both of his arms up there to his elbow, felt around for her intestines, grabbed and pulled them out. Lopez added that Nemeth didn't move while he rearranged her insides, and so he grew worried. So he fetched some water and splashed it on her face. Then, when she remained unconscious, he moved to the bathroom to wash off his bloodied hands before stepping out on the porch for some cigarettes. "I was so nervous, man," he told investigators. "I wasn't thinking, man. I wasn't thinking." Upon returning to the bathroom, Lopez found that Nemeth's corpse made for solemn aesthetics. So he grabbed some nearby items to cover up the tissue he'd yanked out. Finally, he checked to see if she was breathing again before calling the authorities. After confessing to how he violated Nemeth, Lopez tried to get some clues from the investigators. "I know I'm going to jail, but I have 2 kids, How many years do you think this is going to cost me?" By the afternoon of the same day, Fidel Lopez was arrested on the charge of first-degree murder. He was held without bond, and there are no legal protests from his attorney. Records fail to indicate if he even hired one. Lopez's only other legal misconduct was for disorderly intoxication in 2014, as shown on the Florida Department of Law Enforcement. After meeting with his attorneys, Lopez was ready for his court appearance, and a Broward judge set February 13th, 2016, as the date for setting up the jury. Melissa McNeil, a defense lawyer, commented that the move for a speedy trial was made for only one reason, although it was waived more times than used. She ended by saying, "We are ready for trial." Luckily for him, his timing for a speedy trial was beneficial to his case, which had 2 counts of sexual battery and first-degree murder. So, tabling the case to a jury as quickly as possible prevents the state from initiating the death penalty. Before now, Florida's strategy for using the death sentence was deemed unconstitutional and subjected to further verification processes. Within that time, Ilona Holmes, a Broward circuit judge, placed a formal inhibition on the state attorney's office from pursuing the death penalty. Tom Coleman from the prosecuting counsel declined to comment on the state's decision to appeal the ban. Jury selection began in earnest on the due date, and a time was set for the panel to return to court and hear the confession that Lopez had provided to the Sunrise Police Department. A week before Lopez's court appearance, the defense lawyers filed a motion arguing that he wasn't read his Miranda rights properly. Hence, he didn't understand his rights during the interrogation process. The defense also hoped to lower the amount and type of crime scene photos that the jury got to see for fear that the gruesome images may spark unnecessary outrage. This way, the case would be decided based on sentiments instead of facts of the incident. The judges routinely compromised, with Holmes choosing the photos of the crime scene that the jurors got to view. As for the speedy trial, Lopez was arraigned in a Broward courtroom on October 19, 2015. He was brought in wearing handcuffs and striped jail clothes. His deposition was rather stoic for about an hour until Christopher Pagan, the attorney representing him, promptly pulled out of the case. Another Broward Circuit Court judge, Lisa Porter, filed for a new public defender to represent the accused. "A not guilty plea has been entered on your behalf, Mr. Lopez," Porter remarked. It turned out that Pagan and other public defenders on his team, including Caroline McRae and Jose Reyes, had confided in Lopez about a change of representation before his arraignment. Lopez remained behind bars without bond until his next scheduled court hearing on December 10, 2015. This time he pleaded guilty to charges of sexual battery and murder of his 31-year-old girlfriend, Maria Nemeth, to a Broward County courtroom. Owning up to the crime was part of his plan with the prosecutors. The court was adjourned to August 3, 2016 for his official sentencing, where he would serve a life sentence with no parole instead of being served the death penalty. Up next is the tragic case of Christopher Pittman, the 12-year-old who killed his grandparents. The date is the 28th of November, 2001. The peaceful, rural city of Chester, South Carolina, wakes up to the most dreadful news. The house of one of their oldest residents has burnt to the ground. Earlier that morning at about 1:40 a.m., firefighters rushed to the scene of the incident and worked tirelessly to put out the fire. They believed at the time that the house was empty, but when the flames eventually subsided, what they found shook them to the core. They found the bodies of 66-year-old Joe Pittman and his 62-year-old wife, Joy Pittman. But it wasn't the fire that got to them, and it definitely wasn't the smoke. Someone diabolical had shot this old couple to death right before setting their house on fire. The Pittmans had been loving and responsible members of the Chester community for several decades, and their 12-year-old grandson, Christopher Frank Pittman, was also staying with them. But where was he? The 12-year-old's body wasn't in the burnt building, which was a relief. Had he been kidnapped? This was one of many questions that the police had to answer when they arrived at the crime scene. Christopher Frank Pittman was missing, and to make matters worse, his grandparents' Nissan Pathfinder was also nowhere to be seen. Someone had taken it. Was this another case of premeditated murder, arson, and kidnapping? Could it be that the perpetrator of this horrible crime had killed the grandparents, kidnapped the 12-year-old grandson, burnt the house to the ground, and made away with the truck? To the dismay of the cops, the case was getting complicated quickly, and at the same time, it was quickly becoming a mystery. However, nothing would prepare them for the truth. This was a case so bizarre that by the time we are done, you might be left with more questions than answers. To properly understand this case and the senseless murder of Joe and Joy Pittman, we have to go back to the 9th of April, 1989, the date of birth of Christopher Frank Pittman, Joe and Joy's grandson. He was born in Florida to a dysfunctional couple. While his mother was negligent, irresponsible, and absent from his life, his father, whose name was also Joe, was going through a rapid series of bad relationships. It was also reported that Chris's father was violent to him when he was a kid, but we will address that as we move forward with the story. Christopher had an older sister, Danielle, and together they had to endure the chaos of their childhood. However, when things got unbearable for Chris, his grandparents had to step in. Joe Pittman was Chris's paternal grandfather, and everyone who knew him described him as a stern, opinionated man who was also a loving and supportive member of his community. He was a tough man who cared deeply about his faith, family, and music. This was something he could express freely at the local Methodist church in Chester, South Carolina. And he also had a soft spot for his grandson. So when he caught wind of the chaos the little boy was living through, he took him away from Florida and brought him to live with him and his wife in Chester, South Carolina. The change turned out to be the perfect cure for Chris. At first, it was clear to everyone how hurt the young boy was. The Chester community would describe him as a well-mannered but extremely quiet boy. At the Methodist church, members and even the chaplain noticed how reserved Christopher was, and they did their best to make him feel at home. With time, it worked. Christopher became more expressive, fun, loving, and full of life. He adjusted perfectly and found the stability and nurturing environment that every child needs and deserves to have. However, you know how these stories go. It is often the calmest moments that precede the storm, and in the case of Chris, his life was about to course correct back towards the chaos of his past. One day, Chris's father came to South Carolina for his son. His mother had returned, and there was a promise of family once again. So, Chris returned to Florida with his father. Before we continue, I think it's important to note that everything we have mentioned so far happened to Christopher Pittman before he was 12 years old. Not too long after Chris returned to Florida, his mother disappeared once again. He woke up one morning to find that his mother had left without warning. Around this time, his father was also going through his third divorce, and the pressure became so much that one day, a 12-year-old Chris decided to run away. He wanted to be with his grandparents again. He wanted the security and stability he once got from them. But he didn't get that far. The police found him 15 miles from home and brought him back to his father. At home, Chris began to get desperate. He was no longer interested in staying in Florida with either his father or his older sister Danielle. He threw tantrums, and those tantrums soon turned into depressive episodes. Then, one day, things escalated too far when he grabbed a knife and threatened to kill himself in front of Danielle. According to her, he said, "You know, I'd rather die than live in this house with you and Dad." It was this suicidal threat that convinced his father to return him to his grandparents. But it might have been a little too late. Chris had already changed. The community that had once nurtured him into a fun, loving, and expressive kid no longer recognized him. Worse still, he had also developed a foul temper. He was getting into fights with anyone and everyone. With classmates, he had an episode where he choked a fellow student on the school bus. In church, things got to a boiling point on the evening of November 28th when Chris started kicking the back of the piano bench, disturbing the pianist and the entire service. Unsurprisingly, his grandparents were outraged, especially his grandfather, Joe. Chris and his grandparents had to leave church early that day, and when they got home, Chris got a spanking from Joe for his bad behavior. Later that night, the Pittmans, both Joe and Joy, were found with bullet holes in their heads, their house on fire, and 12-year-old Chris Pittman, their grandson, was missing. Now that we have come full circle, I want us to pay close attention to the story because this is where things begin to get bizarre. House on fire? Check. Someone calls the fire department? Check. The next morning, the police arrive on the scene. Back in Florida, Chris's father gets a call that his parents' house is on fire, and he immediately travels down to Chester, South Carolina, only to find out that not only were his parents killed in cold blood, but his son was also missing. By that time, the search for his son was already underway, and it wasn't long before he was found. Christopher Frank Pittman was found in his grandparents' truck by two deer hunters in the woods some miles away from his grandparents' burnt home. The truck had broken down, and Chris told them that he had been kidnapped by a big black man who had shot his grandparents, burnt their house, and kidnapped him. The deer hunters were inclined to believe him, but something was off. The 12-year-old boy was eerily calm. He wasn't behaving like a child who had just gone through that kind of trauma. For a boy as young as him, they expected him to be terrified. When the police came around, he repeated the story to them, and it was so detailed that they believed him. However, they also noticed that he was unnaturally calm, and this led them to believe that he was suffering from shock. So he was handed over to a sheriff's investigator named Lucinda McKellar, who had experience working with children. Chris stayed with Lucinda throughout that afternoon. She also noticed and was impressed by how calm he was and how well he was handling the situation. Throughout the afternoon with her, he played cards and watched TV with her. However, as the sun set onto the horizon, the truth began to come to light. The arson investigator on the case, Scott William, arrived that evening and questioned Chris extensively. And it turned out that Chris had been lying all along about the kidnapping, about the big black man, and virtually everything. It turned out that 12-year-old Chris, armed with a shotgun, had crept into his grandparents' room 4 hours after his grandfather had given him a spanking for his outburst. Chris had shot them 4 times while they were sleeping, killing them instantly. It was him who had set the house on fire. He took the truck, guns, the family dog, and $33 in cash. The 12-year-old had just confessed to premeditated murder, theft, and arson. It was difficult to believe. And what made the situation worse was the fact that Christopher Pittman felt no remorse.
To be sitting in a room with a 12-year-old boy that just killed his grandparents is one thing, and then to actually, hear him say, "I'm not sorry," to what he had done to the people that he supposedly loved the most in his life was pretty shocking.
My God, this is a 12-year-old, and you don't want to believe it, but that's what he was telling us.
Now, why on earth would a 12-year-old murder his grandparents? Grandparents that he obviously loved. Somehow, Chris's father felt that he had an answer to that question. According to him, the culprit was not his son. The true culprit was Zoloft. Yes, Zoloft, the antidepressant. And if you're wondering what an antidepressant has to do with a 12-year-old killing his grandparents in cold blood, then you're asking the right question, because this is where we fit all the last pieces into the puzzle of this tragic story. Let's retrace our steps to the first time Chris had a meltdown. This was after his father had taken him from his grandparents' home and after his mother had once again abandoned him without warning. Around that time, we said that Chris experienced tantrums, and those tantrums devolved into depression. It was mild in the beginning, so doctors placed him on Paxil, an antidepressant. However, things got worse, and we talked about how he threatened to commit suicide if he wasn't allowed to return to his grandparents in South Carolina. His father agreed, and he was sent back to his grandparents. Now, we're standing on thin ice. You see, in Chester, South Carolina, the drug Paxil was not available, so a doctor in the town prescribed Zoloft for him instead. Both drugs are SSRIs, which is a fancy name for classifying a group of drugs that are used as antidepressants in the treatment of major depressive disorders, anxiety disorders, and other psychological conditions. Paxil and Zoloft might have similar modes of selective action, but abruptly substituting one for the other is far from advisable. So when Chris switched to Zoloft, he might have suffered from Paxil withdrawal. He allegedly began to experience the negative side effects of the new medication. His older sister Danielle would testify that her brother complained of a burning sensation all over his body that required painkillers, and that he would often express volatile behavior to the point of becoming manic. And when the side effects were brought to the doctor's attention, what did they do? Well, they doubled his daily dosage from 100 milligrams to 200 milligrams. Now, most would just call this child a sick, twisted killer. But Chris's defense team believed that they had a reasonable explanation. They claimed this increased prescription might have been what led Pittman to choke a fellow student. And it might have been what caused the scene in church that led to his grandfather spanking him. And it might be the reason he murdered his grandparents in cold blood. This was the defense's argument when Chris's case was taken to the court 3 years after the crime was committed. Chris was arrested, kept until he was 16, and then he was tried as an adult on the 31st of January 2005. During those 3 years, Chris's story began to change, but only slightly. He wasn't denying that he killed his grandparents, but he changed some details. He said that his grandfather did not spank him on that fateful evening, and that he killed him because he was under the influence of an overdose of Zoloft. Everyone in his family believed him. Everyone from his older sister, to his maternal grandmother, to his own father. According to Chris, Zoloft had caused what a forensic psychiatrist would later call command hallucinations. In simpler terms, a voice instructed him to murder his grandparents. He said it was like a dream or a television show that he couldn't turn off or stop watching.
These voices in my head just echoing through my head and keep getting louder and louder and louder.
And what were these voices say?
Kill.
The task of convincing the jury that Chris's crime was a result of the negative side effects of the drug fell on the defense, and they brought two scientists to back the claim. The first defense expert was a forensic psychiatrist named Lynette Atkins, who said that on the night Chris killed his grandparents, he was not in control. He was psychotic and heard command hallucinations that ordered him to pull the trigger and burn the house. She also said that his lack of emotions after the murder was yet another side effect of the medication. We must know Atkins, who evaluated juvenile defendants for the state of South Carolina at the time, had a history of testifying on behalf of the prosecution, but in this case, she was on the other side of the fence, so it shocked everyone. The second expert witness that testified on behalf of the defense was Dr. Richard Campbell, a scientist who had worked for the FDA for 14 years and once approved Zoloft for human clinical trials. Now, he believed that the medication could drastically change the behavior of some juveniles by causing chemically induced anger. Also, during the early period of his 3 years of incarceration before trial, another psychiatrist claimed that Pittman was still suffering from mania and used racial slurs on the prison guards. Every argument and evidence from the defense pointed to Zoloft as the true culprit of Chris's terrible crime. However, while the defense was working hard on the Zoloft case, the prosecution worked tirelessly to discredit it. Prosecutors blamed it all on meanness and a kid who was disciplined by his grandparents. They said only an adult-thinking criminal could plot, plan, and pull off such a horrible set of crimes. Because remember, he didn't just kill his grandparents. He set their house on fire and came up with a fake story to hide his disgusting actions from authorities. The prosecution kept this in mind, and efforts to prove the prescription drug played no role in the vile acts. They brought up evidence of volatile behavior that Chris had exhibited before he was introduced to any of the drugs. The defense either denied or waved it off as a boy being a boy. Then, the prosecution pointed out that Zoloft had been on the market since the early 90s and was the most prescribed antidepressant in America at the time. There was no other case where the drug had turned an individual into a monster. Then they brought their medical experts. A psychiatrist named James Ballinger said, and I quote, "There was no evidence that he wasn't thinking correctly. There was a lot of evidence that he knew what he had done was wrong." He also reminded the jury that Chris had thought out a means of escape by blaming the killings on a black man. Then another psychiatrist who had spoken to Chris hours after he confessed recalled how unremorseful Chris had been and how he brushed off his actions with the statement, "They asked for it." Then the final straw was when the prosecution called Vice President of Pfizer, Dr. Stephen Romano, to the stand, and he acknowledged that while their research showed some increased risk of aggression, there was no link to homicide. The judge called the defense aside and gave them an option of a plea deal that could see Pittman get a minimum sentence of 3 years, but they rejected it. The defense lawyers were convinced that the jury could not unanimously decide that Chris was guilty. On the 15th of February 2005, Pittman was convicted of murder and sentenced to 30 years in prison. But was this justice? Eventually, after Chris pleaded guilty on the 11th of June 2007, he was convicted of 2 counts of voluntary manslaughter and will become a free man in 2023 at the age of just 34. Up next is the case of Adrian Gonzalez, the evil teenager who killed his 8-year-old neighbor. In July 2015, the state of California paused when 8-year-old Madison Middleton went missing in Santa Cruz. After the shocking discovery of her remains disposed of in a dumpster, all eyes were on the mystery teenage suspect, who later would be found guilty of the horrific crime. His name was Adrian Gonzalez. Madison Middleton went missing from the Tannery Art Center on July 25th, 2015. At the time, the Tannery Art Center was a complex that housed several apartments in Santa Cruz. Madison lived there with her mother, and so did Adrian. So, you see, the two were neighbors. Barely 24 hours after Madison was declared missing, things took an unfortunate turn when she was found dead in a large trash container. Just like that, a missing person case had become a murder investigation. According to the district attorney of Santa Cruz at the time, whoever killed Madison took great lengths to hide her body because they had been looking for her prior to that time. And that just made the case even more nerve-wracking. If you were wondering, the Tannery Art Center is a facility constructed for the public, which means that it is a non-profit project. The facility contains about 100 budget lofts. Around the time of Maddie's murder, the building housed about 250 occupants, out of which 50 were children. In addition, the center also has a common area designed for children to play whenever they want to. According to reports, Adrian was said to have kidnapped and murdered Madison the same night she went missing. Some might even say that the 8-year-old's life had come to an end the moment she packed her scooter and followed Adrian home because he had promised to get her ice cream. Following that incident, Madison did not get to see the light of day again. The next day, she was found duct taped, strangled, stabbed, and almost taken sexual advantage of. Although it is very common to trace the behaviors of a serial killer back to their home, the same could not be said for Adrian. Neighbors testified that the boy's mother was quite friendly, and that sometimes, when it was the season for holidays, she would prepare meals in large portions and invite her neighbors so that they could eat together. Taking all these into consideration leaves you with one thought swindling around your head. How did Adrian grow up to be a monster? According to reports, Adrian was an amiable and popular figure in the housing complex, who was mostly seen performing tricks with his yo-yo and sometimes playing around with his skateboard. One of the occupants at the Tannery Art Center also affirmed this, saying he was a lovely boy. As far as I know, he is a lovely boy. I think there is something horribly wrong if he did this, and I hope he gets help. I hope he doesn't go to jail for the rest of his life. Even the boyfriend of Madison's mother, Kirby Scudder, had something good to say about Adrian. He described Adrian as a soft-spoken, admired, well-liked, and well-rounded teenager. On the other hand, Adrian's Instagram account told a different tale altogether. Although his Instagram account has since been taken down, it was said that his handles were something like awkward yo-yoer, and in his Instagram bio, he called himself a 15-year-old yo-yoer that lives in Santa Cruz. It was also reported that the very day Madison went missing, Adrian had posted a photo with a caption which he copied from the lyrics of a song. The caption read, "The dreams in which I'm dying are the best I've ever had." Despite the lyrics being from one of Gary Jules's popular song covers known as Mad World, you have to admit that the line is quite chilling. Before Adrian's account was taken down, it was reviewed by some reporters, and people who did the job mentioned that the accounts had a number of posts where he expressed how anxious, lonely, and unloved he felt. The reporters also found one of his posts on Instagram where he posted a photo of himself with the caption, "Wear all black and try to look powerful and hide the crippling anxiety toward the future and constant worry that I'll never find someone who loves me." Whether these posts were just a puberty-driven teenage phase or expression of true mental illness, the sentiment surrounding Adrian stood the same. A well-rounded, kind young man. So the ultimate question is, what could explain Adrian's motives to commit such a horrible crime, where an innocent young girl had no choice but to pay the ultimate price? Jeffrey Rossell, the district attorney at the time, had said that they couldn't quite figure out the reason Adrian murdered Madison. He said, "People do things for a lot of different reasons. Sometimes we understand them, sometimes we don't." The defense attorney in charge of Adrian's case, Larry Bigman, was however bent on proving that Adrian could seek rehabilitation in the juvenile justice system. He said that Adrian didn't have the intricacy to carry out the murder of Madison. In his words, he's not a super sleuth. Gonzalez is a socially awkward, shy, and suicidal boy. That, combined with the stress of home life, school life, and social life, led him to take someone else's life instead of his own. His emotions hijacked his brain. He was an anxious flea on a hot brick. He didn't have the courage to kill himself, so he had to do something. On the other hand, the prosecutor in charge of Adrian's case had a very different opinion. According to him, Adrian's crime was one of the most egregious and shocking crimes in Santa Cruz. He added that all the while Adrian torturously did all that he did with Madison up until he killed her. He was neither remorseful nor regretful. And while the police and FBI agents went searching for Madison, he was just so calm. Prosecutor Vasquez said, "He's calm and very matter-of-fact, casually playing with his yo-yo." Even after Adrian got arrested and was being led away by the police, his face was devoid of emotion. According to the prosecutor, and in opposition to the above statement made by Adrian's defense attorney, Adrian is a cold, calculated, sexual, deviant killer who can't be rehabilitated. We're dealing with lifelong disorders. This is not a quick fix, and there is no guarantee. Adrian's confessions would later be read out in court, and sympathizers of the Middletons would not help but cringe, especially considering how graphic the confession was. One extremely disturbing part of the confession was how Adrian had allegedly opened up to a detective and said that the thought of Madison dying made him sexually aroused. Adrian would later reveal to the police that he also stabbed Madison when he found out that she wasn't dead, even after putting her inside a bag. After Madison's parents had filed a missing person report, the police and even FBI agents began to search to find their daughter. According to KTVU's Janine De La Vega, while these agents were searching for Madison, Adrian would go around spinning his yo-yo and asking if there had been any news concerning the search. It was also recorded that Adrian was so interested in knowing if they had found anything that he went around asking for updates. Eventually, the police and FBI agents saw in a surveillance video Adrian carting the body of Madison, who appeared dead at the time, and throwing it into a large trash container at the Tannery Arts Complex. Shortly after the police and FBI agents found the body of Madison, Adrian had tried to make a run for it because he was also present at the scene. However, he was arrested before he had the chance. According to Cron 4 reports, Adrian revealed while in custody that he had thought of committing suicide while the police were searching for Madison. After Adrian's arrest, his scheduled first appearance in the courtroom before Santa Cruz Superior Judge was postponed. On the same day, however, his defense attorney, Larry Bigham, had told the reporters gathered outside, "Our job is to review evidence and conduct our investigation and make sure that the minor, like every citizen accused, receives a fair trial. At the end of the day, I am confident that this case will be handled professionally and thoroughly and fairly." According to the district attorney of Santa Cruz, Adrian was not only found guilty of murder, but also kidnapping and about 4 offenses relating to sexual crimes. And for that reason, if Adrian got convicted, he would get sentenced to life imprisonment. However, Adrian could not get such a sentence because he was still a teenager at the time. At the conclusion of Adrian's hearing in 2017, John Salazar, the Superior Court Judge of Santa Cruz, ruled that Adrian could now be tried under adult proceedings as he was already 18. According to Salazar, he based his ruling on evidence that Gonzalez was sophisticated, intelligent, and observant. He also mentioned that there was barely enough time for Adrian to get rehabilitated by the operations of juvenile justice, and that Adrian's case should be tried in adult courts if the gravity of the crime he committed is anything to go by. In 2019, however, a 1391 bill was passed by the state Senate that children who are younger than 15 cannot be transferred to court for adults. Shortly after the bill was passed, John Salazar came out to say that it was unconstitutional. And as a result, Bigham, Adrian's defense attorney, appealed to the state Supreme Court because of Salazar's response. He made this move because if he were successful, Adrian would be sent back to juvenile court. Bigham said, "That decision should come down soon. All of this is taking too long for everyone." It no doubt takes an emotional toll on the victim's family, and it has put Adrian in an adult jail with more sophisticated criminals with no treatment. To Bigham's delight, the state Senate declared that Bill 1391 was constitutional, and this was after rounds of legal challenges. Bigham said, 1391 knows kids' teenage brains are under construction and that they have a heightened capacity for change. 1391 means that authorities have to look at the backstory. They have to look at the history. They have to look at the context and deal with the issues. Not just Adrian, but other 14 and 15-year-old kids who commit very serious crimes. This development paved the way for Adrian's case to continue. And as a result, a hearing was scheduled for April 15th. On April 15th, 2021, Adrian pleaded guilty to the murder of Madison Middleton, as well as all the other charges that were against him. However, because of the 1391 approved bill, he would only need to remain in juvenile prison until he turned 25. That was his sentence. Before his sentencing, however, he made a statement asking for forgiveness from Madison's family. He said, "I understand there's very little I can say after all the pain and suffering I've caused. My goal is to work on my issues so that no one has to experience what you have endured. I am aware that this does not change the fact that I have brought you tragedy, loss, and devastation. I am hopeful that when I take the time to apologize, you may accept my apologies for the actions that I have done and what they have brought you." Liberating for Adrian was the fact that Michael Middleton, Madison's father, revealed that he had come to terms with the death of his daughter and bore no grudges against Adrian. The father revealed, "That does not make anything easier. It just allows me peace. The alternative could be to hold the darkness, but this would only consume my soul. I refuse to poison my soul and existence. Forgiveness is the only path, and I believe that Madison would agree." Michael Middleton, however, also pointed out that Adrian should have been sentenced to life imprisonment instead. He disagreed with Adrian's defense attorney, expressing how he had doubts that rehabilitation can do anything for the offender. In his words, "Adrian Gonzalez should never have the opportunity to repeat these crimes again. A crime of this nature should not be swept under the rug. I do not see this scenario as possible, based on the severity and sophistication of the acts that were committed." The judge, John Salazar, who presided over Adrian's case, ruled that Adrian must also be registered as a sex offender for life. He also mentioned that since the Santa Cruz Senate Bill of 1391 states that juveniles cannot be prosecuted as adults, there were limits to the penalties he could impose on the offender. He said, "There is no way for anyone to understand the profound and absolute pain and grief a family experiences when losing a child under these circumstances. I can add that the torture of losing a child in this manner was prolonged and extended by the change in the law. Our criminal justice system has been left with no answers nor comfort that can be provided to you to mitigate what you have had to endure." When Adrian turns 25, which is October 2024, he will be released from juvenile prison and would be required to pay compensation fees of more than $22,000. While some believe that since Adrian committed this heinous crime at such a young age, he should indeed be given another shot at life, however, many others are of the opinion that 10 years in the system and a permanent spot on the sex offenders list is nowhere near a reasonable penalty for this horrific crime. Up next is the case of the teen who murdered his high school crush. If there is one thing we have learned from serial killer cases, it is that when you catch the killer, you already know where the body of the victim is. That's why it is so unsettling that in the case of the disappearance of Kipling Davis, the reverse is the case. It has been more than 10 years, and her supposed killer, Timmy Brent Olsen, still hasn't told the authorities where her body was buried. Would they ever get to find out? And why is the killer being so tight-lipped? Keep watching to find out. Kipling Davis was born on the 1st of July, 1979 to parents Richard and Tamara Davis. While not much is known about her early childhood, what we do know is that before she went missing, she was a student of Spanish Fork High School, located in Spanish Fork, Utah. Kipling disappeared on the 2nd of May 1995, and at the time, she was only 15. Reports claim that the teenager had a misunderstanding with her parents that day when she went missing. It was said that Kipling used to take driving lessons every morning before school, and so she had to get up by 4:30 a.m. every morning. That particular morning, she had been so tired that she was still in bed even after 4:30. Her dad, Richard Davis, noticed that she wasn't up and ready to go to the driving reserve, so he got her up to get up. Kipling tried to explain to him that she was too tired and that it wouldn't hurt if she missed her driving lesson that morning. Her parents, however, cajoled her until she got up and left. According to them, they knew how much she had been looking forward to learning how to drive, and they couldn't allow anything to deter her, even for a bit. Kipling obeyed her parents, but she was so upset when she left the house. Upon getting to school later that morning, Kipling went on her usual tasks, making sure not to miss any of her classes that morning. According to her classmates, the last time they saw Kipling was during lunch in the school cafeteria. And although Kipling missed the rest of her classes for that day, which implies that she could have chosen to head home earlier, she wasn't found at home either. Apparently, she had told some of her friends that she would not be available to attend the activities they had planned later in the evening on that day, stating instead that she'd rather take the time to run away from home because her parents had gotten her upset in the morning. According to Kiplin's parents, their daughter would typically return home from school by 3:30 p.m. But that fateful day, she still wasn't home even after they waited until 5 p.m. Alarmed, the doting parents began to look for Kiplin. Soon, they decided they would go to Kiplin's church to look for her, and if they didn't find her there, they would then report to the authorities. Unfortunately, Kiplin wasn't in her church, so her parents had no choice but to report to the authorities. Initially, the police concluded that it was just a regular case with teenagers where they end up running away from home and that Kiplin would eventually return from wherever she went. Her parents, however, did not share this sentiment, and they tried convincing the police that Kiplin would never do a thing like that. And when that failed, they decided to keep searching for their daughter on their own. Left with no choice, Richard and Tamara began calling friends of Kiplin in school and asking if they had seen her. To the couple's dismay, everyone kept saying that the last time they saw her was during lunch and that she had missed the 4th and 5th period in school that day. Kiplin's parents, fixated on not giving up, reached out to more classmates. Luckily, a classmate named Eli claimed that he saw Kiplin during 4th and 5th period and that she was taking a fellow classmate named Christopher Jepson. Following this discovery, Kiplin's parents stumbled upon her diary where she mentioned having a crush on Chris. So they began to wonder if she had gone to Chris's. However, upon reaching Chris's house, Chris's sister was the only one home, and she told them that Chris hadn't returned home from school yet. On hearing this, Kiplin's parents speculated that the two had probably gone out together and that they would check back in to see if Chris would return with Kiplin. Kiplin's parents kept searching for their daughter regardless, and around midnight, they came by Chris's house. According to them, there was a car outside, and they could see that there was a light in the house, which meant that Chris was probably home. But they didn't go in because it was already past midnight, and also because they felt that if Chris had returned with Kiplin, the family would have reached out to them. The following day, Kiplin's parents continued reaching out to friends and classmates in the school. They got the police involved again, and this time the authorities began to investigate Kiplin's classmates. Among those who were investigated are Christopher Jepson, Timothy Brent Olson, and a close friend of theirs, Davis Rucker Leifson. All three of them had the same story. Chris, who was the primary person of interest at the time, said that he had indeed spoken to Kiplin after lunch, but he had classes afterward which he left to attend. And after that, he had stayed back in school, specifically in the auditorium, with Timmy and Rucker to hang out and set up the place as it was his job at the school at the time. Despite meeting a dead end with Chris, Rucker, and Timmy, the police got a more interesting testimony that seemed like a useful lead. Another classmate, Brandon, said that he had spoken to Kiplin after lunch as well. He had asked her out on a date, but the two couldn't go out on a date later because Brandon apparently had a girlfriend at the time, and she got mad when she heard that her boyfriend had asked out another girl. Classic high school drama. Brandon also mentioned that he couldn't find Kiplin during the 4th and 5th period, so he went out of school to look for her, thinking she might have skipped school because she was upset about the cancellation of their date. To clear his name, the teenager went on to say that when he couldn't find Kiplin, he decided to skip school altogether, and to prove that he wasn't lying, he told the police that he had called a friend to help him because of a flat tire. Because the police didn't want to rule out anything, they decided to verify Brandon's story. And it turned out that Brandon didn't have a flat tire. He didn't call the friend who he claimed to call. Following this discovery, the police became very suspicious of Brandon. But because they didn't have any evidence, combined with the fact that all the testifiers were minors, left the authorities with their hands tied. Days turned into weeks, and weeks turned into months. Still, nobody knew where Pittman was. As time passed, the local police were forced to recognize the possibility that what started out as a missing person case could be a homicide. Pittman's parents were also of the opinion that their daughter could have possibly been murdered. Following her disappearance, some people started spreading rumors about places where Pittman's body could possibly be. But, till this day, Pittman or her remains are yet to be found. About a year later, it was said that Chris went to Pittman's parents out of the blue and kept saying that he didn't do anything. Richard thought there was more to Chris's unexpected visit to their house, so he began to probe further. Chris, however, panicked and left the house. As soon as Chris left, Richard went to the police because he thought that something was fishy. The police also agreed, so they called in Chris and his friends, Tim and Rucker, for questioning. During their interrogation, Tim shared a different statement from the one that he shared a year ago. He wrote that they had driven to the canyon and that he watched Pittman and Rucker walk away, but that Pittman didn't come back with Rucker. Before Pittman's parents could celebrate this new finding, which might have led them to know where Pittman's body was buried, Tim immediately changed his statement. It appeared that Rucker had threatened him, warning him about ever mentioning his name in the Pittman case. The authorities then decided to carry out a polygraph test. Surprisingly, however, the three passed the test. Years passed and still, nothing new came up. Chris, Tim, and Rucker had all grown into men. Still, Pittman's parents refused to give up. Richard started sending out writings about Pittman's case until it got the eyes of the grand jury. With so much publicity, the case of Pittman's disappearance began to appear on TV. And this aided in the resuscitation of the case. People began to come out and share testimonies about Pittman's death. One time when Pittman's case came up on TV, Chris had been partying with friends. When Tim saw the case on TV, he got angry and said that Pittman deserved it. Chris's wife also came out to testify that she had been watching a movie, So I Married an Axe Murderer, with Chris, and had jokingly told him to tell her one thing nobody knows he did.
You've ever done.
According to her, Chris unflinchingly looked at her in the face and said,
"What if I told you I killed Pittman David?"
And obviously afterward, he laughed it off, saying it was a joke. While all these new testimonies were coming up, the authorities also found out that the auditorium which Chris, Tim, and Rucker had claimed they were hanging out on in the evening of Pittman's disappearance was actually in use. Apparently, a choir performance was going on in the auditorium at the time, but somehow that information missed the authorities for several years. Because several testimonies kept coming up, Pittman's parents then decided to declare their daughter dead. She was declared dead on May 2nd, 1995, the day of her disappearance. As for Tim and his friends, the police suspected that they had something to do with Pittman's disappearance, but because there was really no evidence, neither were they willing to give out any helpful information. The judge could only charge them with perjury since it was clear that they were all lying about the case, especially since Tim, who took back his statement about seeing Rucker and Pittman walking off in the canyon. Tim was sentenced to 12 years, mainly because more of the testimonies had been directed at him. Chris was sentenced to 5 years and Rucker 4 years in prison. To top it off, only Chris and Tim were charged with Pittman's murder. In 2011, Tim admitted that he had witnessed the death of Pittman and that she had been hit 2 times on the head with a rock. He said that he had driven Pittman and the killer to the canyon, and that he watched as the killer, along with Pittman, walked out of his sight. After about 40 minutes, Tim claimed that he heard raised voices, and so he decided to go and see what was going on. He saw the killer hit Pittman on the head with a rock. Pittman fell due to the impact, and the killer, seeing that she fell, rather than doing away with the rock, went on to hit her again the second time. The killer then beckoned on Tim to help so they could move Kiplin's body underneath some trees. The two then got in the car and left with the plan to return that evening to bury Kiplin's body somewhere else, which they did. In May 2021, during Tim's trial, Tim refused to say anything in court and only answered questions that were passed by the judge concerning renunciation of his trial rights and to formally plead guilty. His defense attorney later stated that Brent had been feeling remorseful, and so he decided to come to terms with the plea bargain, partly because he wanted to bring closure to the Davis family and his as well. Tim was asked to recount all that transpired the day Kiplin went missing, which was the standard thing to do at a parole hearing because it shows whether or not the offender could be open and honest with the crimes he committed. Tim refused to say anything, however, saying he would speak to his lawyer first. At this point, Tim had to be reminded that the legislature recently signed a bill that people found guilty of homicide would not be granted parole unless they work with authorities to first recover the remains of the victim. Tim was also told that the governor, Spencer Cox, had also signed the bill into law. Still, he did not budge. In one last attempt to find Kiplin, Tim was also informed that if he wants to be released from prison early, he has to show board members that he at least put in a great deal of effort with helping to recover Kiplin's body. Tim kept going back and forth in court that day, and his reluctance quelled Richard Davis to the point that he had to pipe in. Richard pleaded even more with Tim, stating that he thought Tim's heart would have softened after all those years. Tim only replied, saying he's done all that he could and he had nothing else to offer that would change the situation at hand. According to the board members, since Tim refused to help find the remains of Kiplin, he automatically did not meet the requirements for parole. That therefore means that Tim will remain in prison until 2026. According to the parole board, this decision will only be reconsidered if Brent is willing to help act in good faith in finding the remains of Kiplin. While we are not strangers to the tales of disappearances, you have to admit that the case of Kiplin Davis is as unnerving as they come. To this day, there are several speculations about what actually happened to Kiplin and the reason why Tim continues to keep his mouth sealed, despite numerous pleas. As does with cases like these, questions arise, where all we can do is guess. With that said, what do you guys think about this case? Up next is the truly evil case of the serial killer fans who murdered an innocent woman.
We're looking for a female missing person who's been missing for about 11 days. Okay, she's been missing for 11 days, so obviously we need to find her. Okay. And because you look like the person we've seen on CCTV, we just get some details off you, alright? I'll probably chop all my hair off.
On the 14th of May 2019, a woman by the name of Julia Rawson was reported missing by her partner. She hadn't been seen for 3 days. Police used the town's CCTV footage to find Julia's last movements. Who and what was seen on that footage would solve an awfully chilling murder case in the town of Dudley, England. The duo's motives behind the crime were equally chilling. Jack the Ripper, son of Sam, BTK, the Zodiac Killer, the Hillside Strangler, the Toolbox Killers, the Killer Clown, countless other names. These serial killers and many others have been the perpetrators of horrible crimes throughout history. And yet, despite their heinous crimes, and some of them facing the longest possible sentences or meeting grisly ends, there seems to be a sort of fascination for them. A fascination that can often end up making them immortal. For example, Jack the Ripper lived over 100 years ago, and his actions were so gruesome, he was sometimes regarded as an otherworldly presence. But he is still spoken about with some sort of reverence. Through their infamous actions, they attain a level of fame that is unlike any other. There is an entire culture that is dedicated to the world of serial killers. As Julia Beck for The Atlantic puts it, in trying to make sense of the darkest extremes of human behavior, the public turns murderers into myths and monsters. It is this research into what makes human darkness tick that affords celebrity status for many serial killers. This is why they may live on in history and be remembered by the public far more readily than those who have completed more noble acts. At the end of the day, the desire to see what drives the mind of the serial killer is an attraction many are drawn to. Most times it's harmless. and people in the world of serial killer fandom do it within the bounds of mild weirdness. Most people know how and where to draw the lines between what is a pop culture reference and what is just downright wrong. But as we have the good, so does the bad find its way to the fore, and this could lead to deadly consequences. Welcome to Twisted Minds, and as you know, we take deep dives into the darker parts of human nature. Today, we take a look at what happens when a fascination with serial killers becomes an unhealthy obsession, and how it led Nathan Maynard Ellis and David Leasley to the murder of Julia Rawson. Julia Rawson was a 42-year-old artist who lived on New Mill Street in Dudley, West Midlands, England. She was known affectionately to her friends as Ju, and had a longtime partner named Elaine Higginson. The couple had planned to move in together, having been together for 2 decades. They had once lived together in the past, but then separated and eventually rekindled their relationship. Julia was well known within their community for her positive and kind nature. She was also very outgoing. She was described as dressing like a rock star or the leader of a rock band, and was very confident. And you would typically find her in and around local pubs, cheering on local bands and talking to friends. She was that type of person that even if you didn't know her personally, you might have heard of her. Julia grew up in Stafford, 25 miles north of Dudley. She was an avid lover of art, even going on to study it at the University of Birmingham in her youth. To make money, she and Elaine ran a store out of the Dudley market, specializing in the sale of pagan-related items. On May 11, 2019, a Saturday just like any other, Julia and Elaine had spent the weekend in neighboring Wolverhampton, and as the day ended, they disagreed on their choice of evening activities. Elaine was tired and just wanted to relax at home, while Julia was having too much fun and wanted to spend some more time outside. So the couple said goodbye to each other, with Elaine going home and Julia boarding a bus to Birmingham. However, she would find out that she had accidentally taken a bus that was headed to Dudley, a mistake that she didn't consider too serious, seeing as she lived there. Julia would go to the local pub called Bottle and Cork and order a drink. The pub is located about 150 yards away from where Julia reportedly lived. It has a very sophisticated CCTV system that records all of the pub's activities from 5 p.m. till 2 a.m. Julia had spent a couple of hours in the pub when an unknown male walked in at about 10:47 p.m. carrying a shopping bag. He sat by himself and ordered a drink. Recognizing him as someone she did not know and not wanting to sit alone, Julia introduced herself and seemed to show interest in his very distinctive forearm tattoos. She kept the stranger company all throughout the night until the pub closed at 2 a.m. and they left together to an unknown destination. Apparently, Julia had felt the night was still too young and did not want to go home yet. That was the last time anyone ever saw Julia Rawson alive. It's about this time that we take a look at Nathan Maynard Ellis, who plays a central role in Julia's last moments. Nathan Maynard Ellis was born on May 21st, 1990. He suffered from a form of autism that affected his ability to interact with people in a normal fashion. It also made his behavior and thinking patterns rigid and repetitive. Nathan was described as having a penchant for violence, especially against women, and was well known by social services. He had been quoted as having dark thoughts, which involved torturing, taking sexual advantage of, and killing women. Not surprisingly, he had an unhealthy obsession with true crime and horror movies. He had books full of crimes that serial killers had committed. Some of his fixations were on Levi Belfield, the bus stop stalker, Peter Sutcliffe, the Yorkshire Ripper, Jeffrey Dahmer, the Milwaukee Cannibal, Ed Kemper, the co-ed killer, Harold Shipman, Dr. Death, and many others. He had custom horror movie masks in his flat of horrors, which was the name that media and authorities gave to his apartment upon investigation. These masks were strewn all over the walls, and there were others he hadn't finished working on. Horror movie memorabilia covered most of the apartment, and reports described the Tipton-located apartment as having a choked appearance. Nathan was also a criminology student at some point, although it's unclear what his education status was when he met Julia Rawson. Julia and Nathan were seen leaving the pub together and shared a taxi that presumably took them to Nathan's flat in Tipton. No one is sure what happened once they arrived there, but you can imagine how unnerving it must have been for Julia once she entered his flat. Elaine last spoke to Julia just before 11 p.m. on May 11th. When she woke up the next day and couldn't find Julia and saw that none of her calls or messages had been answered, she became worried. It had been 10 hours since their last contact, so she called her sister Jacqueline to ask for advice on what to do next. Jacqueline suggested calling the police and also said it might be a good idea to retrace Julia's steps from the night before to see if any clues could be found. Of course, the search came up short. Elaine then called the police and a missing person report was filed. In the course of their investigation, the police reviewed the CCTV footage and saw Julia talking to the unidentified man at the bar. They asked Elaine if she knew who he was, and after she couldn't, he was marked as the case's first lead. Julia's friends took the investigation up a notch, posting social media appeals and asking anyone if they had seen Julia. They also placed missing persons posters all around the community, hoping someone would come forward. The images of the unidentified man were printed and passed around to the police community support officers. This would eventually lead to the finding and arrest of Nathan Maynard Ellis. On May 22, 2019, 10 days after Julia's disappearance, a security guard at a Dudley shopping center got in touch with the police and informed them that he had just seen someone matching the description of the unidentified man. His forearm tattoos were a dead giveaway. In truth, Nathan Maynard Ellis wasn't a hard man to identify. Rather, he stood out with a full beard and a cap, the same one he had been wearing when he was captured by the CCTV camera. He was in the company of his partner, David Leasley. Nathan initially denied knowing anything about Julia Rawson, going as far as saying he didn't even know there was a missing woman. He denied spending the evening of May 11th with her at the pub. Furthermore, he made a disturbing joke saying, "If I was responsible for someone being missing for 11 days, I would probably have chopped off all my hair." It was probably the most uncomfortable joke the authorities had ever heard, especially in the grand scheme of things. It was all they needed, however, to arrest both men on suspicion of kidnapping Julia Rawson. Their flat was subsequently searched and its contents were documented. The Flat of Horrors is a stone throw away from the Birmingham Canal, further down from its Victoria Park. The canal is also sided by an extensive barren wasteland, leading into a railway line that is no longer in use. These areas were locations where the police would search for the now presumed dead Julia Rawson. News of the arrest spread like wildfire, leading to a witness who had been mentally, physically, and sexually taken advantage of by Nathan Maynard Ellis, coming forward when she realized who she was seeing on her TV. She would tell the police the kind of person Nathan was in great detail. Eventually, with his identity no longer in question, more CCTV footage would be found, showing Nathan and David walking along the canal with large shopping bags filled to the brim on several occasions. This was not all. Blood stains were also discovered under a new carpet in the flat. The couple also had newly purchased a sofa, which led authorities to question what had happened to the old furniture in the house. Again, CCTV footage would come to the rescue, showing that Nathan and David had dumped the blood-stained items at the local tip in broad daylight and in full view of the public. The major breakthrough would come a month and a half after the disappearance, when a male witness came forward, saying he had seen two men walking across the wasteland as he took a smoke break. Police searched the same spot the witness described and found two large shopping bags containing human remains. The remains belonged to Julia. More bags were found around the old railway line. Julia Rawson had been cut into 11 separate pieces, some of which had been done with expert precision, while the rest had an amateur or rough look to them. With this discovery, the police concluded that two persons had been involved in the murder and disposal, likely Nathan being the precise cutter and David the amateur. More evidence followed, found at an incinerator close to Nathan's mother's house. Those included blood-stained clothing and a lot of Julia's DNA. Despite the mountain of evidence pointing to the men, they denied any involvement in Julia's death. In fact, they said they weren't responsible for her ending up dead, but admitted to spending time with her and being aware she was dead. According to their accounts, her death was an accident. Again, all evidence pointed to these being lies. Despite having just killed someone, David and Nathan went about their lives normally, spending time with family and chatting about TV shows that they had enjoyed. Unfortunately, even though the body had been discovered, there was no indication of the time or cause of death, thanks to the body being dismembered. Authorities could only speculate that Julia Rawson was murdered sometime between the early hours of May 12, 2019 and May 14, 2019. Neither man has confessed to or shared details about the murder to date. Jurors at the trial of Maynard Ellis and Leslie heard how Nathan was fascinated with decapitation and horror films, and how he was addicted to fantasies about the sexualized killing of women. Counsel for the prosecution, Kareem Khalil QC, told jurors at the start of the trial that his victims would have seen swords and spiders mounted on the walls of the Tipton flat, reptiles kept in tanks, and gory face masks of horror film characters. Miss Rawson could not have known that she was about to enter a flat of horrors, but she must have realized this very soon after she went in. Police said Nathan Maynard Ellis had gone out on the night of the murder with the sole aim of finding a victim. David waited for them in the apartment. Unfortunately, that victim was Julia. No one knew why Julia decided to go back to Nathan's flat in Tipton after meeting him by chance, but anyone who knew Julia would recall that she had an outgoing and friendly nature. She was also very trusting and ready to reach out to anyone she felt was in need of help. In a statement, Julia Rawson's family said her loss was felt as keenly on the day of the trial as when they had heard she had first gone missing. Her death has a devastating impact on us. The mutilation of her body and the callous way in which her remains were scattered has revolted us, they said. The judge, Mr. Justice Sewell, told the jury, "It has been a very demanding case because of the subject matter." Passing his sentence, Mr. Justice Sewell said that he was sure that both men had attacked Miss Rawson about the head with weapons and had then attempted to cover up their evil act in a cool, calm, and thorough manner. Addressing the couple, he said, "You undertook a comprehensive attempt to try and cover up what you had done, and you repeated lies to the police. Only you two knew what happened in the flat, but neither of you has told the truth." The judge further told David Leslie, "I am sure that you were enthralled to Maynard Ellis, and would do, and that night did, his bidding." Nathan Maynard Ellis was also found guilty of 4 counts of sexual crimes and making threats to kill relating to historical allegations made by a woman following his arrest, the witness we mentioned earlier. Both Nathan and David admitted to perverting the course of justice and concealing a body, but they still maintained they had no hand in dismembering Julia Rawson. They were both sentenced to life in prison at Warwick Crown Court in December 2020. Nathan Maynard Ellis was told he would serve at least 30 years in prison. David Leslie, as an accomplice, would face a minimum of 19 years for his actions. Unfortunately, some people don't know where to draw the line. In the end, Nathan and David's perverse fascination with serial killers and their evil ways led to the death of someone fondly described as a beautiful human being. Up next is the sickening case of the 13-year-old who murdered a 6-year-old. What do you do when play among children becomes a situation with adult consequences? This was what happened in the case of Lionel Tate, who was only a boy when the justice system handed him the heaviest blow possible. Lionel Alexander Tate became the youngest person in American history to be sentenced to life in prison without the chance of parole. Tate was convicted of first-degree murder in 2001 at the age of 14 for the 1998 brutal murder of 6-year-old Tiffany Unick in Broward County, Florida. Lionel Tate was the kind of kid who loved all sorts of play, but had a history with violence. Before the controversial incident, Tate was well known in the schoolyard as a bully. He was the type that would pick on kids he felt were smaller than him just for the sake of it. Despite his reputation for violence, no one could seriously think this 14-year-old was capable of cold-blooded murder. One thing you should know about Tate is that he loved wrestling. He just couldn't get enough of it. His favorite TV show was WWE SmackDown. There, he watched his idol, Dwayne "The Rock" Johnson, perform crazy stunts on his opponents. Each time he watched it, he would practice the moves at home. His mother didn't think much of her son's violent tendencies, and Tate was allowed to run wild and free. One day on the 29th of July, 1999, Tate's mother, Kathleen Grossett Tate, was asked to babysit a little 6-year-old girl named Tiffany Unick. It was a hot afternoon, and soon enough, Kathleen felt very sleepy. She went upstairs to take a nap and left the 2 children alone. While she was sleeping, 12-year-old Lionel Tate got bored and started to play with Tiffany. He decided to practice some of the moves he had learned on TV on young Tiffany. After a bit of demonstrating all the pro wrestling moves he had learned, Tiffany had already been punched, kicked, and stomped in almost every way possible. After a while, Tate soon realized something was terribly wrong. Young Tiffany was no longer breathing. Tate ran upstairs to tell his mother what had happened, and by the time they got downstairs, Tiffany Unick was already dead. Tiffany's death was caused by blunt force trauma, according to the coroner's findings. Lionel Tate, a playground bully, wounded her young body to the point where she bled from her mouth, nose, eyes, and ears. Her skull was damaged in multiple places, as were her ribs. Her brain also flattened inside her skull. A part of Tiffany's liver had broken free and was floating freely inside her body as a result of the horrific beating she received from Lionel Tate. Prosecution described her injuries as equivalent to those she would have suffered if she had fallen from a 3-story building. The thought of being Tiffany's parent and having to make that identification at the morgue, looking down at the brokenness, the dried blood, the horrible bruising on her arms, face, and torso, and knowing that the lifeless shell lying there on the hospital bed was your daughter, your baby, is enough to freeze any parent's blood. Every inherent instinct a parent has is to shelter, protect, and defend, and this would be rendered ineffective by inconsolable anguish. Lionel's mother, Florida State Trooper Kathleen Grossett Tate, claimed that her son was simply playing with Tiffany and that her death was a tragic accident. Miss Grossett Tate stated on January 2, 2001 that she couldn't believe it when the Broward County Circuit Court jury in her son's murder trial delivered a guilty verdict after 3 hours of deliberation. She felt positive he'd be acquitted. Lionel Tate's case was transferred to Judge Joel T. Lazarus for sentencing after the circuit court returned a guilty verdict. Lionel Tate was tried as an adult under Florida law, which does not require him to actually have intended to kill in order to be convicted of first-degree murder. Prosecutor Ken Padowitz explained, "He didn't have to say, 'I'm going to kill Tiffany Unick.' All that is required is that he planned to act, not that the consequence was desired." This case caused a lot of controversy in America back then. The country was divided between viewing it as a simple act of childish playfulness or a brutal murder with cold-blooded intent. Jim Lewis, the boy's defense attorney, never argued that Lionel Tate did not murder Tiffany Unick. Lewis's defense was centered on the boy's love of professional wrestling, which displays planned and choreographed acts of severe violence. In essence, Lewis claimed that Tiffany's death was not Lionel's fault, but rather the World Wrestling Federation's. According to him, Lionel Tate deserved to be pitied, not punished. There is enough evidence to demonstrate that Lionel Tate was entirely responsible for his acts, and that he understood what he did was wrong. For example, when the cops arrived to arrest Tate, he protested that all he'd done was give Tiffany a bear hug. Later, he admitted that he tried to toss her onto a couch, but missed and instead slammed her into the stairwell banister. More horrors were discovered as he was pressed to give his entire narrative, leading one to believe that this schoolyard bully knew the level of his brutality was totally over the top all along. When Judge Joel Lazarus declined to lower Lionel Tate's first-degree murder conviction to a lesser penalty, he was clearly thinking about this. He was certainly also thinking about Lionel's lawyer and mother, who appeared in a non-stop whirlwind of morning news talk shows and press briefings, all meant to create an outpouring of compassion for Lionel. Attorney Jim Lewis and Tate's mother, Kathleen Gossett Tate, were so confident that their message of "it was all a sad accident" would be accepted by the public and Judge Lazarus that they immediately dismissed a plea bargain agreement offered by prosecutor Ken Padowitz, which would have resulted in Lionel only serving 3 years in prison plus a 10-year probation period. Lewis and Gossett Tate truly believed that Lionel, who had a history of bullying other children, would be fully cleared of any responsibility for Tiffany Unick's death. You see, they said his intention when he stomped on her ribcage was only to play with her. They were taken aback when Judge Lazarus subjected them, the mother, the lawyer, and the bully, to a 45-minute tongue lashing, in which he chastised them for their respective roles in entirely trivializing a human existence. The judge then imposed Florida's obligatory sentence for first-degree murderers: life in prison without the possibility of release. In sentencing Tate to life in prison, Broward County Circuit Court Judge Joel T. Lazarus stated that the crimes of Lionel Tate were not the pastimes of a youngster. In his opinion, Lionel Tate's actions were cold, ruthless, and indescribably cruel. The judge declared from the bench in Fort Lauderdale that the evidence of Lionel Tate's culpability is clear, evident, and unmistakable. That evidence backed up the jury's decision. Tate became the youngest person in U.S. history to receive a life sentence without the possibility of parole 2 years after Eunice's killing. However, in 2003, an appeals court overturned his conviction, and he was released a year later. He avoided a retrial by pleading guilty to second-degree murder in return for a year of house imprisonment and 10 years of probation. During his probation, Lionel Tate got mixed up in another brush with the law. Here's what happened. At 2 a.m. in September 2004, authorities found Tate a few blocks from his home, brandishing an 8-inch knife. Tate was arrested for what they termed as a pizza robbery 9 months later. And given his history of troubles, this one could have landed him in prison for the rest of his life. According to Tate's arrest report, the following occurred. A pizza delivery guy named Gallardo was delivering the pies to a unit in Pembroke Park around 4:20 p.m. Gallardo turned around to leave when there was no response from the second floor flat. The delivery man then heard someone shout, "Hey," as he descended the stairs. He stepped back up, noticed the door to the unit was slightly ajar, and entered. Gallardo told the police that behind the door was a black man wearing a black bandana over his mouth and brandishing an old firearm. Gallardo identified Tate as the robber later that evening. Tate was then held without bond and went through 3 defense attorneys in an effort to exonerate himself. The evidence against Tate, who is now 20 years old, appeared to be strong at first. He admitted dialing dominoes to place the order. When police examined the apartment belonging to a man named Willie Carruthers, they discovered a pair of maroon shorts. Gallardo claimed the assailant wore these, and they had traces of Tate's DNA. While he was locked up, Lionel even accepted a plea bargain, but later changed his mind. Indeed, the 2 private investigators that were given the case unearthed information that prompted detectives to look into the role of Carruthers. Carruthers was 16 at the time of the pizza heist and resided on the first floor of the building where the crime occurred. Carruthers, an aspiring rapper known as Little Will, met Tate through common friends sometime in late 2004. According to a sworn statement Carruthers gave authorities in September 2005. On the day of the crime, Tate texted Carruthers, "You still want to bust that lick after school?" Carruthers explained in the statement that bust a lick is slang for robbery, and that Tate was alluding to stealing from an anonymous Hollywood teenager who had a lot of money. But that never came to pass. Carruthers dismissed it as nothing but talk. Carruthers reported he was standing on the sidewalk outside the apartment complex when Gallardo pulled up. Carruthers informed the attorneys that Lionel was on top of the staircase. He also claimed that he was the one that ordered the pizza. Carruthers said he heard Gallardo scream and saw Lionel point a gun at the man a few seconds later. That contradicts Gallardo's story. The pizza delivery man stated he had not seen anyone before knocking on the unit's door. Carruthers, whose fingerprints were discovered on the pizza boxes, also failed to disclose the black bandana, which should have been visible. Enter Quincy Tompkins, a 12-year-old boy who resided in the flat where the robbery occurred. Tompkins initially informed BSO police that he witnessed Tate rob Gallardo. Tompkins, however, recanted his story to private investigator Carrillo 2 months after the robbery. Tompkins said Tate was not present during a sworn deposition on October 11, 2005. In his testimony, he claimed Carruthers was standing at the front entrance with a revolver tucked under his waistband when the pizza delivery arrived. Tompkins watched Carruthers take out the gun, and that was when he ran into his room. When Tate's defense attorney asked why he didn't identify Carruthers from the start, Tompkins responded that he was afraid. Carruthers had promised to murder him if he said anything. Then there's Zawalski Edwards' story, a convicted felon who called Tate's defense team from jail. According to the 2 private investigators, Edwards was in Carruthers' apartment the night of the heist, and he claimed to have seen Carruthers wearing maroon shorts and then putting them on top of the cabinet, where the officers found them. And on February 9th, a forensic case study by Virginia-based Bode Technology Group discovered large evidence of Carruthers' DNA on the black bandana used in the violent robbery. Despite all of this, Lionel Tate was still sentenced for violating his parole. He admitted to being in possession of a gun on the day of the robbery, though he refused to tell the prosecution where he had hid the gun. This is a clear case of someone who has been institutionalized by the American justice system. If only he was properly rehabilitated before being released into the world again, he might have had a chance. Lionel Tate was sentenced to 30 years imprisonment for the parole violation, as well as 10 years for his role in the robbery. He is set to be released in 2030, though we can only hope he doesn't get into any more trouble after his release. What do you think about this controversial case? Let us know in the comments section below. Up next is the vile case of Adrian Campbell. Although all of the cases covered here on Twisted Minds are dark, this one is definitely one of the worst. Be warned. On the 1st of July 2018, 6-year-old Alicia McPhail was enjoying family time on the Isle of Bute. Alicia and her mother, Georgina Loughran, lived in Airdrie, Scotland, but came to the Isle of Bute to spend some time with her father, Robert McPhail, his girlfriend, Tony McLaughlin, and Robert's parents. Robert had a lot of fun plans for his daughter, who he rarely got to see, but sadly, those plans never happened. On the night of the incident, Alicia went to bed at around 11 p.m. and had fallen asleep watching her favorite cartoon, Peppa Pig. The next morning, which was the 2nd of July, Alicia's grandmother made the gut-wrenching discovery that Alicia wasn't in her bed. After waking up everyone, she frantically called the police. The police helicopters were in the air in no time, with an army of police officers searching the island. Angela even made a Facebook post, which quickly got a search party together. 2 hours into the search, one of the volunteers made a gruesome discovery: the lifeless, naked body of the 6-year-old. It was evident that the girl had been sexually taken advantage of by the injuries she had. All 7,000 residents of the small island were shocked to the core, with the police desperate to capture the monster who had committed the sickening crime before they had the chance to strike again. What really shook the people of Bute was the notion that the killer could be roaming among them. Jeanette Campbell, a local resident, had helped search for Alicia but wanted to do more. She quickly took to her CCTV footage in hopes that she could spot something unusual on the night of the crime. On the night of the murder, Jeanette's 16-year-old son, Aaron, had a party at their house and invited 15 of his friends. After things got rowdy, fueled by too much booze, the party came to an end around midnight. Aaron and his mom had a huge argument over one of his friends damaging a piece of furniture. After the argument, Jeanette stormed off to bed, but that wasn't the case for Aaron. On the CCTV footage, Jeanette's heart stopped when she spotted her own son leaving the house several times between 2 a.m. and 4 a.m. on the night of the murder. Frightened, Jeanette asked why did he go out so late, to which her son replied that he had to go find his phone and later get weed. She then asked if he or his friends had seen the missing girl, to which the teenager simply replied, no. Knowing that something wasn't right, Jeanette told her son that whoever took sexual advantage of and killed Alicia would have left DNA on the body. Aaron, again denying seeing the girl, telling his mother that they wouldn't find any of his DNA on the girl as he had not seen her. Jeanette, not convinced by her son's answers, handed the footage over to the police, who quickly took the teen in for questioning. Despite what he told his mom, Aaron's DNA was found on Alicia's body, proving that he was the monster who had abused and murdered the child. He was charged with her abduction, sexual crimes, and murder, to which Aaron denied any involvement. He even went on to plead not guilty and claimed that someone else had killed Alicia and was trying to frame him. He even went as far to say that it was Alicia's father's girlfriend Tony trying to set him up. The pathologist concluded that Alicia had suffered catastrophic injuries to her face and neck, which had killed her. He went on to explain that the girl had been smothered and had also been jerked so violently that it had damaged her spine. All in all, Alicia suffered 117 injuries. What supported the fact that the girl was carried to the shore was that her feet were clean with no injuries. To make matters worse, Alicia suffered unthinkable genital injuries, with one doctor explaining that they had been caused by severe and forceful inflicted penetration. Who is Aaron Campbell? People who knew Aaron Campbell described him as a smart teenager, a popular young man who liked video games and sports. But unbeknown to all around Aaron, he had a twisted dark side that was capable of some seriously despicable acts. Like many teens, Aaron enjoyed creepy horror characters like Slender Man, a supernatural fictional character who stalks its prey before killing them. Aaron also enjoyed gore and violence in his video games and movies, which could have been one of the reasons that Aaron got obsessive thoughts to kill. Now, this doesn't mean that everyone who likes horror movies is going to become a serial killer, but if you have psychotic tendencies and thoughts about killing, it will no doubt be a source of inspiration. Aaron was also obsessed with creepypasta, a forum for creepy fictional stories shared by its users. Little did he know that he would become the inspiration for other creepy stories. As Aaron's interest began to spiral, he struggled to find enjoyment in the things he spent most of his time doing. Eventually, a new interest began to take form. Unfortunately, it was an interest for bloodshed outside of his screen. What makes this case all the more tragic is that the victim he selected would be someone he knew he could overpower. A guaranteed kill who wouldn't be a threat to the coward. It turned out that on the night of the murder, Aaron tried to get some weed after acting extremely depressed from none other than Robert McPhail and Tony McLaughlin. He texted the couple but got no response, so then he decided he would break into the house and help himself to the drug. Aaron managed to walk straight into the house with nobody noticing, but soon realized that there was no weed in the house. What was in the house, however, was a sleeping 6-year-old. Now, his craving shifted from smoking weed to something twisted, sickening, and depraved. Aaron had never met Alicia before the murder, but that didn't stop him from picking her up from her bed and taking her outside. From there, he took the sleepy girl to a shore area, and then into a wooded area on the side of a former hotel, where the body was eventually discovered. During the trial, the jury was shown CCTV footage that Aaron's own mother supplied. It revealed that Aaron left home at 1:54 a.m., dressed all in black. He later returned at 3:35 a.m. and was no longer wearing his top. At 3:44 a.m., he turned on the bathroom light. And just a minute later, footage showed Aaron leaving once again, this time wearing shorts and carrying something. At 4 a.m., the camera caught Aaron running away from his house with a flashlight in hand. Another piece of CCTV footage in the area picked up a person walking toward the shoreline, carrying what the owner presumed was a child. Aaron's DNA had been detected on 14 different parts of Alicia, along with a semen match. Fibers from Aaron's trousers were also found on Alicia's clothing. So, where does Alicia's father's girlfriend come into this? Well, the defense's case was that Aaron had met Tony McLaughlin earlier that night for sex, and that Tony killed the girl after she was getting so much attention after arriving on the Isle of Butte. After killing Alicia, Aaron claimed that she must have taken the condom used and spread the semen at the scene. With the mounting evidence, it didn't take long for the jury to find the story ridiculous. And just 3 hours later, Aaron Campbell was found guilty of abducting, taking sexual advantage over, and murdering young Alicia McPhail. He was sentenced to 27 years behind bars, which was later reduced by 3 years after an appeal. After the judge shared the ruling, he said, "The nature of these appalling offenses and what I have read in the reports make it clear to me that the reintegration and rehabilitation, while these are important considerations, are remote possibilities, and neither your best interests nor anyone else's will be served by speedy return to the community." Nonetheless, the punishment part will not be as long as it would have been had you been an adult. When asked why Aaron did what he did, he said that he had drank a bottle and a half of wine in the space of half an hour. But this was several hours before the murder. In a report, after being asked what he was thinking when he saw the child sleeping, the killer replied, "It was a moment of opportunity. At any other time in my life, murder wouldn't have been the conclusion. If I was a year younger, I don't think I would have done it. All I thought about was killing her once I saw her." According to the killer, Alicia was sleepy, but woke up to ask the teen who he was. Aaron told her that he was a friend of her father's and that he was just taking her home. He said that he noticed the girl was cold, as all she had on was her pajamas. Aaron then gave her his top to warm her up, and then, a few minutes later, he committed his horrendous acts before throwing his bloody clothes in the sea. He then went home for a shower before returning to the body where he had left his phone. When asked what he was thinking during the time between the murder and his capture, the monster said he found it funny that the police had not arrested him yet. In fact, he said that at some points of the trial, it took everything not to start laughing at the details coming to light, and that he was quite satisfied with the murder. During Aaron's sentencing, a specialist described the teen as having traits on the psychopathy checklist, after conducting a psychological profile of the killer. This was supported by Australian forensic psychologist Tim Watson Munro's specialist opinion, that the teen was a narcissist psychopath who took joy from denying his unthinkable acts. Tim said that there was no hope for him going straight after carrying out one of the worst crimes imaginable. According to the post-mortem of young Alicia, she had not only suffered the suffocation injuries that took her life, but more sickeningly, suffered awful sexual injuries after she died. In fact, they said that it appeared the injury showed that the killing had aroused Aaron. This points the teen to being a sexual sadist, which is one of the worst types of killers going. The post-mortem results were made public, but the sexual crimes, some of which were committed while she was still alive, are far too sickening to discuss further. After his conviction, the investigators in the case shared their worries that Aaron Campbell was a serial killer in the making, stressing that if he hadn't been caught, more innocent lives would have been taken. This is textbook for serial killers, especially ones that get extreme pleasure from the act of murder. What backs this idea up is, a year before, Aaron shared with a friend that he wanted to commit a truly heinous crime. It seems the disturbed teen got his wish. Around May 2022, Aaron Campbell got a small taste of his own medicine when he was attacked by an inmate in Polmont Young Offenders Institute near Falkirk, Scotland. The monster became an immediate target the second he stepped foot in the institution, after mercilessly snatching young Alicia McPhail from her bed and treating her the way he did. The beating was so severe, in fact, that one of his teeth was left stabbed into his lip. Aaron's attacker became a hero around the institute after the bloodied Aaron had to be taken away for protection. Usually, Aaron would keep to himself, but after his door was left slightly open after his meal was delivered to his cell, the attacker took his opportunity to attack the child killer. Understandably, the family of Alicia were not sympathetic to the brutal attack behind bars. Alicia's great-grandfather, George Loughran, said that he hoped he suffered throughout the beating and that he only wished he could have done it himself. It was even reported that the staff had made comments following the attack about how Aaron deserved the beating. I mean, who likes a child killer? Luckily for Aaron, the guards didn't let their personal feelings get in the way of duty and broke the fight up before Aaron lost his life, like Alicia did, which was reportedly the motive for the attack. The attacker faced aggravated assault charges after the beating, but according to the authorities, the man responsible said that it was worth it. When it comes to the prison Aaron is being held in, it has been described by a former inmate as a traumatic place that is worse than any adult prison he's ever been in. It has even had 5 inmates take their own lives in just 4 years. He went on to say that it was the most violent, degrading, and mentally demanding environment he had ever been in. Up next is the insane case of the mother who starved her daughter to death. The case of Angela McAnulty is a peculiar and frankly bizarre case that still haunts the minds of those who witnessed it unfold. Mother of 4 and wife to Richard McAnulty, Angela singled out her oldest daughter, Jeanette Maples, and did unthinkable, horrid things to her in the name of discipline. Angela starved, mutilated, and tortured her daughter to death in the cruelest way imaginable. And all she had to say when she was caught was, "I'm sorry." Let's take a look at how this absolutely tragic case went down. Angela McAnulty was born in California, where she lived with her parents and 2 brothers. When she was just 5 years old, tragedy struck, and her mother was murdered. Unfortunately, the case remains unsolved for the most part. Soon after graduating high school, Angela left home and traveled with a carnival worker who was a lot older than her. Instead of helping her put together her young adulthood, this man introduced young Angela to various drug substances. Not so long after her stint with the carnival worker, Angela got married to another man, later giving birth to 2 sons and a daughter named Maples in 1994. Sadly, it wasn't long after the birth of her 3rd child that the California Child Protective Services took her 3 children from her due to neglect and abuse. In the years that followed, Angela had a daughter and was successful in retrieving her kids who were formerly taken away by state officials. After this victory, Angela went on to marry a long-haul truck driver named Richard McAnulty in 2002, and the entire family left California for Oregon sometime in 2006. It was never discovered what led Angela to abusing her daughter to such extremes, seeing as how her other 3 children were relatively unharmed, but it happened anyway. Maples' maltreatment at the hands of her mother had been reportedly going on for years, as she was often spotted going to her school nurse to treat bruises and cuts to her body. Teachers and friends became increasingly concerned and asked Maples how she got her injuries, and eventually, she opened up to them, telling them that she was abused at home by her mother. The school authorities reported the incident to the Department of Human Services, who paid a visit to the Maples home. When Angela was questioned about her daughter's injuries and accusations, she painted a picture around the situation, making Maples out to be a compulsive liar who would do anything for attention. Unfortunately, they believed Angela's story and left Maples at her home with her mother, not knowing things were about to get much worse for her. Angela took Maples out of school with the reason that she would fare better being homeschooled, effectively cutting off all communications to the public. With no school or friends to notice her condition and no means of asking for help, Maples was left at the mercy of her mother. The only other person who seemed to take notice of Angela's treatment of her daughter was Lynn McAnulty, her mother-in-law. Lynn was concerned about Angela's treatment of Maples, but was also denied access to see her grandchildren. And it was at this point that she began to continuously call child welfare. As it turned out, the concerned grandmother had in fact reported to child welfare just a few days before Maples would eventually die. At home, Angela subjected her daughter to such inhumane treatment that, at 15 years old, Maples was so malnourished and small that she looked like she was a much younger girl. She was forced to sleep on the floor with nothing but a cardboard spread out. She was constantly beaten with leather belts to the point where her blood spattered on the floor, the walls, and the ceilings. In addition to these horrifying discoveries, torture devices of different kinds were found in the house, with chunks of Maples' flesh still on them. According to investigators, Angela would take Maples into what prosecutors described as the torture room, where she would beat and torture her daughter to unfathomable extremes. While she did this, Angela would turn on the vacuum cleaner in a bid to muffle the sounds of Maples' screams so other children and neighbors wouldn't hear it. At times, she would tie Maples up for days at a time, and other times she would collect dog feces and proceed to rub it all over Maples' face and mouth. When Maples was examined, officers found that Angela starved her daughter and left her dehydrated to the point where Maples had to resort to drinking water from the toilet. The teenager's lips were torn and her mouth pulverized from being continuously hit without proper healing. Her face was disfigured from repeatedly being hit with metal objects. On December 9th, 2009, Firefighters responded to a 911 call from Angela McAnulty, who reported that her daughter had suddenly stopped breathing. Firefighters were first on the scene, and they reported seeing Maples lying flat on her back without a shirt in a dark room. While trying to check her vitals and possibly resuscitate her, the first responders found her head in dirty bandages and noticed a wound on her hip. The hip injury reportedly caused many eyebrows to raise because it appeared to have been ripped off as they could see the bone. The officials described her appearance as that of a concentration camp victim, and due to her small stature, they didn't believe when her mother told them Maples was 15 years old. She had wet, smelly hair, cuts above her eyes, and was so skinny you could see the bones on her body. Moments later, paramedics arrived and found that Maples had no pulse. They tried CPR extensively and proceeded to put a tube down her throat, trying to pump air into her lungs. Reports from firefighters on the scene say that Angela McAnulty was a tad bit agitated at first, after which she suddenly went quiet and even laughed a few times. Angela told the paramedics that her daughter simply fell and was fine before falling. At that point, Angela's husband, Richard McAnulty, was also on the scene, but didn't say a word. Maples was taken to the hospital in an ambulance, and there, Dr. Elizabeth Hilton examined her body and found no sign of life. She then went on to pronounce the young woman dead at 8:42 p.m. After examining Maples' body, the doctor discovered the endless, visible injuries all over her body, as well as broken front teeth that appeared to have been smashed in. Alarmed, Dr. Hilton met with the McAnulty family, questioning them on Maples' medical history. Angela answered that her daughter had no previous medical problems, stating she was a healthy young girl. Angela went on to add that Maples had been eating but simply got very skinny, only recently for unknown reasons. Everyone could see right past the lackluster excuses given for her daughter's eventual death, and a search of the McAnulty residence gave all the evidence police needed to arrest Angela and Richard McAnulty. The pair were both interrogated, with Angela denying having any hand in her daughter's injuries and subsequent death. She was questioned by Lane County Sheriff's Detective Aaron Hoberg on how her daughter had gotten her injuries, to which she initially replied, "I don't know." The detective pushed on, asking her about the belts and torture devices they found at the family house. At this point, finally succumbing to the pressure, Angela simply replied by saying her husband was in charge of discipline and he was the one who beat Maples. Detectives have interviewed her husband and the other kids, who all revealed it was Angela that did the beating and not her husband Richard. He had also revealed that his wife had asked him to take the blame for beating Maples, hoping he would receive a lighter sentence on account of his underlying heart condition. Angela later admitted to repeatedly beating her daughter, and when asked why she got so angry at Maples, she said, "I don't know, I just did. I guess the things she did just got to me." She later broke down in what the detectives called a well put on show of tears, claiming she was sorry for hurting her daughter. Angela and Richard McAnulty were charged with the aggravated murder of Jeanette Maples and were arraigned to be tried in court. Prosecutors on the case were seeking a 30 to life sentence for Richard McAnulty, but for Angela, they sought the death penalty. Her case was brought to the court and garnered a lot of media attention as the evil mother who starved and tortured her daughter to death. On the very first day of the trial, Angela McAnulty entered the courtroom crying profoundly and pleaded guilty to the murder of her daughter, effectively moving the case to a penalty phase trial in front of a jury to determine her sentence on the murder charge. The state prosecution attorneys submitted a mountain of evidence against Angela McAnulty in an attempt to land a death sentence. The bruises, the extreme weight loss from starvation, the injury to the head, and the overall state of Maples were all the prosecution needed to make its case. On the other hand, Angela's defense brought a host of witnesses to try to prove her character, hoping to avoid the death penalty and land a lighter sentence. They called George and Mike Fusi, who were Angela's brothers, to testify to her upbringing and childhood. They spoke on how, after their mother was murdered when Angela was 5 years old, their father was the prime suspect, but with no evidence, he was never convicted. Their father would resort to the same tactic of denying them food as punishment, and that hitting them with strange objects was quite regular growing up. The defense for Angela McAnulty brought friends and neighbors to testify how she poses no threat to others, as she has never done anything out of the ordinary to people other than her children. They were trying to get the judge to throw out the death penalty with a motion. The motion was denied and the death sentence remained on the table. A testimony from her husband, Richard, revealed not just Angela's cruelty to her daughter, but his neglect and ignorance, which aided in her death. Richard McAnulty testified that although his wife would turn up the TV or vacuum cleaner when she abused her daughter, he could still hear the screams. He said the screams grew less and less intense as Maples lost weight and eventually became borderline silent because she didn't have the strength to scream anymore. After days of back and forth between the prosecution and the defense, the jury was left to determine Angela McAnulty's sentence from 4 major questions. The first being if Angela's actions that led to the death of her daughter were done deliberately and with premeditated intent. The second was if the actions of Angela toward her daughter were a cause or proof of provocation from Maples or any other external influence. The third is if there was a chance Angela would pose a danger to her family and others if allowed to live out her days in a supermax prison. The fourth and last was simply if she deserves the death penalty. Before the final statements by opposing counsels, Angela asked to speak on the stand, not to testify or be cross-examined, but simply to make a speech to the jury of 8 men and 4 women deciding her fate. She apologized extensively to the jury, the judge, and the detective on the case, acknowledging what she did was wrong. She said, "I am very sorry for hurting my daughter in a very bad way. I want you to know I did wrong, and I am at peace with your decision." In their closing statement, the prosecution recounted detail by detail and witness after witness, painting a picture of just how unthinkable it was for a mother to starve, mutilate, torture, and abuse her daughter to the point of death. We're not talking about an angry drunk. We are talking about a cold-headed killer. After much deliberation, the jury returned with a verdict and found her guilty on all 4 counts recounted earlier, sentencing her to death. This made Angela McAnulty the first and only woman in the state of Oregon to receive the death penalty since it was reintroduced by voters in 1984. After being remanded to a maximum security prison, Angela was kept in separate holding blocks for death row inmates and also for her safety as she was constantly under threat of death. Prisoners don't take lightly to child murderers and abusers and would waste no time in killing an inmate guilty of such crimes. During her time there, Angela ate alone and was only allowed 40 minutes of exercise and shower time a day. To take things further, she could only interact with other inmates through a fence. In July of 2019, District Judge Burdett Pratt overturned Angela McAnulty's death sentence and conviction, citing that her counsel was ineffective in advising her to plead guilty to the murder charge without a concession from the date to reduce her sentence in exchange. He also stated that her lawyers were ineffective in proving that McAnulty did not pose a future danger to society, which would have reduced her sentence from a death penalty to life imprisonment. He added that they were incompetent and failed to prove that obvious trauma from her childhood played a significant role in her present psychological behavior toward her own child. The state's prosecutor's office appealed the ruling, stating it did its part in ensuring a fair trial of McAnulty and was close to winning. But just as the appeals process was ongoing, Oregon State Governor Kate Brown signed SB 2013 into law, which greatly reduced the state's ability to pass death sentences. In July of 2020, Angela McAnulty's case was finalized. She was taken off death row, and her sentence was reduced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole instead.
Up next is the unbelievable case of the TikToker who killed her sister.
This 14-year-old girl took the life of her disabled sister while she was sleeping. Just days before the horrific act, she went viral on TikTok in what are now considered to be some of the most chilling videos ever uploaded to the platform. Claire Miller was born in 2007, making her just 14 years old at the time that changed her life forever. Her parents, Mark and Marie Miller, did everything they could to provide their children with the best lives possible. The two got married in 1997, 10 years before Claire would be born. The two eventually settled down in Manheim Township, Pennsylvania, where they decided to start a family. Claire's older sister, Helen, would be born in 2002. Her birth was a shock for the entire family because the moment she was born, doctors began to suspect that she was suffering from some sort of medical disorder. She wasn't able to interact the other way babies do, and it seemed as though she had trouble moving certain parts of her body. They would soon learn that Helen was born with cerebral palsy. I'm sure that most of us are familiar with this disorder, but in case it's new to you, cerebral palsy is a permanent movement disorder that affects its victims from birth. Cerebral palsy can cause its victims to have very stiff muscles, with many patients being unable to move their arms completely, oftentimes feeling as though their arms or legs are locked in a certain position. Because of this, many patients, like Helen, are confined to a wheelchair for most of their lives. Thankfully, the disorder doesn't necessarily have to get worse as the patients age, so long as they are receiving proper medical care. And it seems like Helen was getting the best care money could buy. Her parents did everything they could to make sure that Helen had every opportunity to enjoy life to her fullest. After just a few short years, Claire Miller would be born in 2007, meaning Helen was about 4 or 5 years old at the time. She would grow up like your average child in the late 2000s, and it seems like her life was going perfectly normal. She had friends at school and was leading a very satisfying life. In fact, her parents were so concerned about her getting a proper education that they enrolled her in Lancaster County Day School, one of the most expensive private schools in the area. Mark and Marie felt as though they were doing the best they could for their children. However, nothing could prepare them for the tragedy that was about to overtake their lives. Over the course of one short night, their lives would change forever. It was the evening of February 21st when Helen Miller decided to head off to bed. She had already done her nightly routine of changing clothes, getting washed up, and brushing her teeth. She would make her way into her room and tuck herself into bed, just like she did every other night. As many teens often do, Helen felt as though her bedroom was one of the safest and secure locations in her life. However, Claire had other things in mind, and soon enough would exploit her sister's vulnerability in the worst way possible. Claire was never considered to be a troubled child. On the surface, she seemed to be a well-put-together young woman, though in more recent months she had been spending a lot of time on social media, particularly websites like TikTok and YouTube, where she amassed a decent following of users who wanted to tune into her everyday life. She would often post vlogs to YouTube in which she would film her daily routine and share her life with her viewers. On top of this, she managed to find between 20 and 30,000 followers on TikTok after several of her videos started going viral. However, something was clearly brewing deep within Claire, a feeling she couldn't quite shake. It seemed that her violent nature would finally awaken on the evening of February 21st. That night, Helen had tucked herself into bed, and Claire snuck out of her bedroom and headed toward the kitchen. Once there, she searched around, hoping to find a pair of rubber gloves. She finally found them, slipped them onto her hands, then continued with her disturbing plan. She spent a few short moments in the kitchen before she decided to reach into one of the drawers and remove a sharpened knife. According to reports, without a second thought, she then headed directly toward Helen's bedroom. Helen had no idea what was about to take place, as she had been deep in sleep at this point. Granted, this was around 1 a.m., so no one in the home was awake when Claire decided to carry out her vicious and cruel attack. As she entered Helen's bedroom, she slowly approached her sister's bed and attacked Helen by jabbing her in the neck. Though this wasn't the end of her attack. She proceeded to attack her sister several more times before deciding that was enough. She struck her one final time in the neck before quietly exiting her bedroom and making her way to the front door. By this point, the sheets had turned a crimson red, and it became very clear that Claire had pushed Helen to the point of no return. As Claire reached the front door, she casually exited the home, making sure not to wake her parents. Then she headed down the front porch steps. She removed her rubber gloves and, according to investigators, seems to have tried to clean the blood off her hands using the snow that covered the ground. We don't know why she chose to do this instead of washing her hands in the sink inside, but I think we can assume that it was probably done to avoid waking up her parents, but that's just a guess. She would leave her bloody gloves on the snow-covered ground, making her way toward the front porch steps. It would seem that at this point, the reality of what she had done had just began to sink in. She began to get confused and disoriented, unsure of what she had just done and concerned about her actions. Then, after all this effort to keep quiet and not wake her parents, she did the unthinkable. She called the police. When the dispatcher answered the phone, she explained what she had just done. Needless to say, officers were on their way to her home and immediately arrived within minutes. When police began to pour into her driveway, they noticed that Claire was covered in blood from head to toe. Her shirt had been soaked with blood, as well as her pants. According to one officer, the blood was so heavily staining her clothing that it was literally dripping off as she stood outside on the cold winter night. Officers then say that Claire revealed her dark deed to them in one simple sentence: "I stabbed my sister." At first, police felt as though Claire was mistaken. They felt that in reality, Claire had been left in shock by something that took place within the family home. They couldn't believe that a young girl like Claire would be capable of such an unspeakable act. They did their best to console her and get more information out of her. And it was at that moment that she directed officers to investigate her older sister's bedroom. Inside, they found Helen's bed, covered in blood with the murder weapon still jutting out of her neck. As police began to search Helen's room, the truth of what had just taken place became shockingly clear. The evidence was apparent as ever, and officers knew right away that Claire was to blame. When they first approached Helen's bed, they found that she was lying face up, covered under sheets and a pillow. One of the first responding officers removed the pillow that covered her face and found that the murder weapon was still lodged in Helen's body. Even though it seemed very apparent that there was no hope for Helen, officers decided to do their best to try to resuscitate the young girl. Though after many failed attempts, they realized that their efforts had all been in vain. By this point, Claire and Helen's parents had both awoken and had learned about what had taken place. They were completely blindsided by the news and couldn't understand what would lead Claire to do such a horrible thing. To say that they were left in a state of shock would be a dramatic understatement. When they went to bed the previous evening, they were a loving, happy family of 4. Now, after being woken up in the middle of the night, they learned that their family had been torn apart in the blink of an eye. One of their beautiful young girls was taken from this world, and the other was removed from the household and placed in custody while awaiting trial. It was every parent's worst nightmare, yet also a scenario that no one could have ever been prepared for. As officers headed outside of the home to arrest Claire for what she had just done, they claimed that she showed no sign of remorse. Instead, she just kept chanting, "I killed my sister." The unfortunate part about this is how vague officers were in their report. We don't know if Claire was chanting this in a way to show she was proud of what she had done, or if she was just repeating this phrase in a state of shock. I would love to believe the latter, but given how vicious the crime was that she had just committed, we really can't be too sure. After Claire confessed to the crime, she was taken to the local police station and placed in an interrogation room. Even though she had just given a confession at the scene, police needed to make sure that she wasn't being pressured into confessing to the crime. As it would later turn out, there was no pressure. Claire had simply decided to claim the life of her sister for virtually no reason at all. In fact, that's what makes this case so insane. No one has any idea what Claire's motives was for taking the life of her sister. Police have not revealed if she explained the situation to them in private, and her attorney is not making any comments about the situation either. As soon as the details about the case were released publicly, Claire found an additional 10,000 followers on TikTok. In the end, she ended up with 32,000 TikTok followers, but TikTok would eventually shut down her account after they claimed that she violated the terms of service. Claire made her way to court in March of 2021. Obviously, cases of this nature can be tied up in court for a very long time, so we don't have many more details at this moment. What makes this case even more tragic is that it seems as though Claire will never have a chance of bettering herself or turning her life around after what she did. Even though she is only 14 years old, she is being tried as an adult, According to several news outlets, this means that she could be given a life sentence or even be given the death penalty. Regardless of where you stand on the case and regardless of whether or not Claire will be sentenced to life or death, it is truly tragic to see two young lives that were completely thrown away. We will simply have to wait and see how this case plays out to know what kind of punishment Claire will be facing. At the end of it all, we're still left with so many questions that may never be answered. There's been a lot of speculation about Claire's motives. Since the crime took place, some of her friends have spoken out about Claire and claim that she had always seemed to have a fascination with death. Her friends claim that they feared Claire may have been suicidal or potentially homicidal. However, her parents deny these claims and say that her younger friends don't truly understand what they are saying. Her parents say that Claire was always a happy child and showed no signs of being depressed and certainly no signs of being violent. However, there is a much darker theory about why Claire did what she did. According to Daily Mail, there is a chance that Claire claimed the life of her sister because she simply wanted the attention. As I'm sure you know, having a disabled sibling is not easy for anyone involved. Having a serious disability like cerebral palsy requires a lot of time and care from your parents. So much of their daily lives were dedicated to making sure that Helen was taken care of. This meant that they didn't have as much time to give Claire the attention she may have wanted. Another spin on this theory is that Claire understood how much time and effort her parents put into taking care of Helen, so she felt as though claiming Helen's life may have been an easy way out for everyone involved. On top of this, it was rumored that her parents were dealing with money issues at the time as well, so it's possible that she may have claimed Helen's life to remedy that situation too. Obviously, these reasons to take one's life make absolutely no sense to the regular person, but we're clearly not dealing with someone normal here. Truth be told, we will likely never know why Claire did the horrible things that she did. It is almost certain that she will now sit in a prison cell for the rest of her life. It's not uncommon for cases like this to have a silver lining. However, in the case of Claire Miller, there is no silver lining. There is no brighter side to this situation. There is only hurt, sorrow, and tragedy. Up next is the shocking case of the 12-year-old killers. At this point, we've seen enough juvenile criminal cases to understand that children and teenagers are entirely capable of diabolical, violent actions. In the same way, we've also seen enough juvenile and adult criminal cases to understand that the environment and circumstances surrounding one's upbringing often play an important role in the kind of life they can go on to live and the activities they carry out. These two realities found their intersection in the case of Catherine and Curtis Jones. The siblings, who were 13 and 12 at the time of the conviction, had endured a myriad of abnormalities in their formative years. These experiences led them to a place of meticulously plotting the annihilation of their primary and perceived accomplice oppressors. Welcome back to Twisted Minds. My name is James, and today we will be taking a look at the previously unknown story of the youngest convicted adult murderer, Catherine and Curtis Jones. Want to know what kind of experiences they were subjected to at the time that led them to a place of violence at such a young age? Or are you interested in finding out how these two ended up being the youngest adult criminals? Keep watching to have these questions and many more answered. The exact date of Catherine's birth is uncertain, but she was born in 1985 to her parents, Curtis Jones and Stacy Parks. While this seemed to be the start of something beautiful, underneath was a gory reality that the Jones couple had been living in. According to Stacy, she had been enduring physical abuse from Curtis since just after the pair began dating. The abuse was so bad that one of Curtis's violent outbursts, which happened when Stacy was pregnant with their first child, Catherine, caused her uterus to tear, and Catherine was born prematurely. About a year later, on the 31st of May, 1986, the couple welcomed their second child, Curtis Fairchild Jones. The family of four continued to live in relative happiness, and they cherished the company of one another. Or at least, that was what it seemed like when the two young children were just happy to see their parents around. Beyond what was obvious to the children, Stacy continued to endure physical abuse from Curtis. It is speculated that the children became aware of the situation at some point. Eventually, it all became too much for Stacy to bear, so she packed her things and left home in 1989. Unable to take the then 4-year-old Catherine and 3-year-old Curtis with her for fear that her mother would reject the children because they were biracial, Stacy left the 2 children in the care of Curtis Sr. At the time, Stacy thought that she was doing the best thing for her children, but she could not have been further from the truth. With Stacy's departure, what was once a foursome had become a trio, and so the children would learn to adjust to the new arrangement and enjoy the company and attention of their father. But that too would soon be threatened. It is unclear just how things developed from 1989 when Stacy left Curtis, but by 1994, just 5 years later, she could tell that all was not well with her children. In the 5 years after Stacy left Florida for Kansas, one of Curtis's male relatives had begun living with him and the children. At first glance, this doesn't seem like too much to worry about. After all, family members live together for financial or other reasons at different points in their lives, right? Well, the problem with this particular relative that no one was aware of or just chose to ignore was that he had a very concerning criminal history. In addition to spending 6 years in prison for robbery, this unidentified relative was also a registered pedophile. In 1993, just a year before suspicions began to arise, this relative had been convicted of sexual crimes involving his then-girlfriend's daughter, who was 14 years old at the time. In 1994, when Catherine and Curtis visited their mother in Kansas for the holidays, Curtis revealed to Stacy that he had been enduring abuse at the hands of this relative. Curtis Jr., being the only other male in the house, had to share a room with the relative, and according to him, he was being fondled by the older man. As it turns out, Catherine was also suffering the same fate, but it is unclear whether she spoke up at this time. Following Curtis's statements, reports were made and an investigation began, but records show that investigations into the case were closed after young Curtis changed his story, saying it had been a lie, most likely under compulsion or fear. That might have been the single mistake marking the point where everything began to go wrong. On the part of Curtis, his parents, and the authorities, if someone had done something a little differently, things might have turned out much better than they did. Sadly, that was not the case, and a huge tragedy was in sight. In the meantime, Curtis and Catherine continued to suffer physical and sexual abuse with short-lived periods of outspokenness and quests for justice. Records show that 2 years later, in 1996, another case regarding the Jones children was opened. An investigation was undertaken concerning Curtis sustaining a bruised and swollen eye. It is uncertain just how far this investigation went and if any substantial findings or actions were made, but judging from the fact that things continued in the same abusive manner in the Jones household, it is very unlikely. Just months before the murder, in September of 1998, a third investigation was started. This time it was concerning Catherine. The 13-year-old girl had run away from home, and her school teacher, being worried for her welfare, made a report stating concerns that Catherine was being taken sexual advantage of. An investigation was opened, and authorities admitted to finding some indicators that Catherine was being sexually abused. However, like the ones before it, the investigation was short-lived. According to Catherine, she had previously tried to tell her father of the abuse, but he did not believe her and took the side of the relative in question. By the time the investigations began, Curtis Sr. intimidated Catherine into lying to the officials and denying that the abuse ever occurred. Also, frightened by the possibility of being separated from her family, Catherine gave in and the investigations were brought to a stop. Despite not diving deep into the situation, as many believe that they should have, investigators reportedly warned Curtis Sr. about his relative living with the family, given the criminal history of this relative and the danger he posed to the children. While trouble in the form of investigation was warded off in the Jones household, trouble continued to brew within. Both Curtis and Catherine were still being taken sexual advantage of by the family member, and it seemed like their father and his girlfriend, Nicole Spites, who had begun living with the family, could not be any less alarmed about the situation at hand. The siblings soon found companionship and solidarity with one another, with Catherine revealing that Curtis was the only one who believed her when she came out with the sexual allegations against their relative. He said that he believed her because it happened to him too. The breaking point for Catherine, according to her, was when a few days after the last investigation was closed, she was taking a shower. The relative in question came into the bathroom, pulled the shower curtains open, and began masturbating. The traumatized Catherine huddled in the corner of the bathroom and sobbed until he was done. When he was done, he left 50 cents on the top of the toilet seat for Catherine. After the incident, Catherine wrote in her diary, "I'm going to kill everyone." She was angry that she and her brother's cries for help were going unanswered by her father and his girlfriend. And so, she concluded that they deserved to die alongside their abuser. Catherine eventually told Curtis about her desires to end the adults' lives, and the pair began plotting to bring this dream to life. They were going to free themselves from torment by killing their abuser and eliminating the chance of this event ever happening again by killing the people they believed allowed the abuse to occur in the first place. On the 6th of January 1999, the siblings' plan was set into motion, with their father briefly stepping out of the house and their abuser not expected to be back until later that evening. The children were home alone with Nicole. Hoping to receive minimal opposition by killing one person at a time, with no one else in the house, the two set out. The 29-year-old Sonia Nicole Spites sat at the dining room table, working on a 500-piece jigsaw puzzle while the children went and retrieved their weapon of choice, their father's 9mm semi-automatic pistol. Catherine took the first shot, hitting Nicole in her stomach. However, she dropped the gun due to the rebound of the shot she fired. Curtis picked up the gun and ran wild, shooting at Nicole and all her surroundings. In all, 9 bullets were fired, 4 which fatally wounded Nicole. As soon as the shots were fired and Curtis caught his breath, reality set in, and he began to freak out at the realization that he had killed someone. This wasn't just some fantasy in our heads anymore. It was real, Catherine said in an interview. Catherine did her best to calm her brother down, and the pair set to work in an attempt to clean up the scene. They dragged Nicole's body away from the dining room and tried to use bleach to clean up the bloodstains. After that, the two tried their best to make it look like a robbery had occurred, and then they fled the house, stopping briefly at their neighbors to tell them that they had shot the gun by accident. Having tied loose ends up to the best of their ability, Catherine and Curtis hid in the woods nearby their house. It is unclear just who alerted the police about Nicole's death. However, it is likely to be the neighbors whom Curtis and Catherine confessed to, or perhaps Curtis Sr. came home to his girlfriend's dead body and alerted the authorities. Either way, the police were alerted and investigations began. One could say that this was the only investigation into the happenings at the Jones household that ever yielded any actual results. Learning from the witness reports of the neighbors that Curtis and Catherine were responsible for the murder, the police went in search for them. The children were eventually found on the morning of the 7th of January 1999. They were in the woods near their house, where they had hidden for the night. And now reality and the consequences of their actions were staring them in the face. At the ages of 12 and 13, Curtis and Catherine were the youngest people to be charged as adults for first-degree murder. If found guilty, which was very likely to happen, they were to be sentenced to life in prison. However, seeing as they were very young, prosecutors were able to strike a deal with the children, allowing them to be tried for second-degree murder, which had a sentence of only 18 years in probation for life. This deal also meant that there was not going to be a proper trial of the children's case. No witnesses, no evidence, nothing. Young, inexperienced, and scared, the children accepted the deal. Through all of this, neither Catherine nor Curtis spoke up about the real reasons for their actions, most likely anticipating that they would not be believed, as it had happened in the past. It soon became widely accepted that they killed Nicole out of spite for taking all of their father's attention away from them, and because he had planned to marry her. The media and other onlookers believed that the children feared that their father's relationship with Nicole would affect the current dynamic they had with their mother. Alan Landman, Curtis's lawyer, said about their silence, "It's almost like they had a pact of silence, and for some reason, they thought that that would help them. He said that had he been aware of the abuse at the time of the trial, they could have had a much better opportunity at getting a better sentence. However, Mayor Todd Goodyear, an official at the Brevard County Sheriff's Office, firmly believed that the children's actions were inexcusable. In his words, there are a lot of people who have been abused and didn't do something like this. At some point, you have to take responsibility for your actions. And they did pay the price for their actions. In August of 1999, now aged 13 and 14 years old, Curtis and Catherine were each sentenced to 18 years in prison, followed by a lifetime of probation. There didn't seem to be much activity in the siblings' prison lives for the most of their first decade in prison. In 2004, however, Curtis gained a short taste of freedom when Hurricane Francis wreaked havoc on the facility where he was being held. Age 19 at the time, Curtis and several other teenagers fled the juvenile detention center, but their freedom was short-lived, and they were recaptured just 24 hours later. As punishment, his sentence was extended by 318 days. 5 years later, in 2009, the truth of the circumstances surrounding the murder came to light. In an interview with the Florida Today newspaper, Catherine revealed that she and her brother were taken sexual advantage of, and their frustrations led them to murdering Nicole. Catherine expressed regret for taking Nicole's life, but also mentioned that she was relieved when she got to prison. She said, "I know it sounds like really messed up, but there was a point where I was just away from all that, and I was by myself, and I was safe." Catherine also revealed in the interview that she had only seen her brother once since they were imprisoned. The siblings used to communicate by mail, but that stopped when Curtis was moved to a new prison facility, and the warden said it was unacceptable for them to communicate, as they were co-defendants in the case. Ramus Fleming, a U.S. Navy senior, read a 2009 story and was touched by Catherine's experiences. He reached out to her in writing, and the two became pen pals. The pair sparked a romance through their letters and got married in November 2013 at the Hernando Correctional Institution Chapel. Catherine was 28 years old at the time she got married to Ramus. Ramus himself soon began making plans and adjustments to allow him to support his wife better, as she was soon to be released from prison. Around the time that Catherine was to be released, Ramus retired as a naval officer to allow him more time to walk her through life outside of prison, as a lot had changed since she was 13 years old. After serving a little over 85% of their original sentence, Catherine and Curtis were released from prison. The exact date of Catherine's release is uncertain, but she was released roughly 2 weeks before her brother Curtis, who was released on the 28th of July 2015. The two were aged 30 and 29 years old, respectively. Curtis left prison as an ordained Christian minister and has gone on to continue his life as one. Catherine, on the other hand, has gone after a more traditional life. Unfortunately, her marriage with Ramus did not work out too well, but she has forged ahead and has so much to be grateful for. She received a presidential academic scholarship for school and will be able to attend college as long as she can maintain a 3.75 GPA. Catherine is also contributing efforts to ensure fair sentencing of young people. Both Curtis and Catherine are working hard at adapting to the technological and social changes that occurred in the 16 years that they were in prison, while also making sure that they do not violate the rules of their probation. So far, all appears to be going smoothly.
Up next is the case of the nerd who hid a body under his bed. On November 3rd, 1988, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton disappeared at around 5 p.m. from her home in Jacksonville, Florida. She was last known to be playing outside before her mother reported her missing. After noticing that her little girl was nowhere to be seen, the search for Maddie soon began, with the FBI getting involved in the desperate hope of locating the young child. Flyers with the picture of the missing girl were passed out around town, and many volunteers from the community offered their support. Unbeknown to the authorities, however, included in those trying to help was the killer himself, a young boy who claimed the life of a young girl by accident. Although, after you hear this awful story, you may think differently. Josh Phillips was born in Pennsylvania on March 17, 1984. His father, Steve, was both an alcoholic and a drug addict who often abused Josh and his mother Melissa, with Josh and his mother later reporting that they were both terrified of Steve and hated living with him. Steve ruled the house like a dictator and forced his family to follow incredibly strict rules. Steve hated it when Josh had friends over, and he had an extreme dislike of young girls in particular. On many occasions, Josh was left embarrassed by his father screaming at him and his friends, which often resulted in the other teenagers leaving the house feeling frightened and confused. Josh, however, got the brunt of these moments, having to face the violent wrath of the man afterwards. At some point, the family decided to move to Jacksonville, Florida. Despite being quiet, 14-year-old Josh was known to be friendly and was well liked by everyone in the neighborhood. One of the neighbors he made friends with was an 8-year-old girl named Maddie Clifton, who lived across the street from him. According to Maddie Clifton's mother, Josh and Maddie were good friends before the incident, despite the age difference. On November 3rd, 1998, Josh broke one of his father's many rules. The rule was that Josh wasn't allowed to have friends over while he was home alone. On that fateful day, 8-year-old Maddie Clifton had walked to 14-year-old Josh's front door and asked if he wanted to play outside. Josh said yes, and the two began a game of baseball. The two were having fun until, during the game, Josh accidentally hit Maddie in the eye with a baseball. She began bleeding, and because of the pain and shock, she began to cry and scream loudly. This terrified Josh because he thought his parents would get home soon and his father would have exploded at the scene. Thoughts of being beaten petrified the boy, and in a snap decision, Josh dragged Maddie inside of the house. As he dragged her through the house and up the stairs, the clothes on her lower half came off. Now, Josh claimed that wasn't meant to happen, but some experts believe that evidence proved that they were intentionally removed. With that being said, an autopsy report stated that there were no signs of sexual crimes. At the time that Maddie was being dragged through the house, Maddie continued to scream in sheer terror. In an attempt to silence the girl, Josh took hold of his baseball bat and hit the poor girl with it. Eventually, the screaming stopped. In fact, all movement from Maddie stopped. Josh decided that the only way to hide the body until he could dispose of it properly was under his waterbed. Yup, he put the corpse of an 8-year-old girl under his bed. Steve and his wife returned home shortly after, acting like nothing was wrong. Josh left his room to speak with them for a little while before going back into his room. To Josh's horror, he realized that Maddie was still moving around beneath the waterbed. He quickly lifted the mattress and heard the young girl moaning softly in agony. The terrifying thought about what Steve would do to him engulfed his mind. Now, he had a half-naked child, beaten almost to death, lying on his bedroom floor. Josh quickly sneaked down the stairs, took a kitchen knife, and returned to his bedroom. To silence the girl forever, Josh cut Maddie's throat and then stabbed her in the chest several times before placing the waterbed back on top of her to cover up his heinous crime. When Maddie failed to return home by 5 p.m., her parents grew worried and called the police. Police and family members searched the area for Maddie's body for 6 days, with Josh being one of the most devoted of the search party. This meant that Josh slept on top of a corpse for almost a week. Despite it being a waterbed mattress, he still would have felt the lump beneath him. Here on Twisted Minds, we often see the killer helping out in murder cases and joining in the search parties. Although this might just seem like the killer is being sick and getting joy out of deceiving everyone in their community, including the victim's family, some experts believe that it is a way for them to stay close to the investigation to reassure themselves that they are not suspected of the crime. After being asked about getting involved in the search party in an interview, Josh replied, "I was putting myself in a fantasy world that nothing had happened. That was my defense mechanism for everything when I was a kid. I never made the decision to ignore it. I just did it." On November 10th, however, that fantasy was about to come to a crashing and life-changing end for all the families involved in this awful case. On November 10th, Josh's mom decided to help her son get a head start on cleaning his room. Previously, Josh's father and mother had been nagging him to get it done, but the young teen always had an excuse to avoid it. On the day in question, Josh and Steve left the house at 7 a.m., which gave his mother Melissa a couple hours before work to start cleaning up the mess. As Melissa wondered where she would begin, she noticed a wet spot on the floor at the corner of Josh's soft side waterbed. She instantly thought the bed had sprung a leak and touched the side to see how bad the leak was. She realized that it was completely soaked and decided to fix the leak rather than start cleaning. As she lifted the corner of the mattress, she noticed a white sock poking out from under it. Figuring it belonged to her son, she began tugging on it, but to no avail. It was at that time that she noticed black electrical tape on the bed and thought that Josh must have tried to fix the leak previously so that he didn't get in trouble with his father. After removing the tape, she reached back to grab the sock. However, this time, she felt something else. Grabbing her flashlight, Melissa pulled the frame of the bed and reached back inside to grab whatever it was. At the time, she had no idea what she was holding, but whatever it was cold. With Melissa disturbing the bed, trying to see what was beneath it, the stench of decomposition stung her nostrils. Now, everyone knows the horrors that could be living under any teenager's bed, but in the case of Josh Phillips, it was so much worse. Getting a better angle, Josh's mother shone the light into the space and discovered something that she wasn't prepared for: the corpse of the missing girl who lived across the street. Melissa's first thought was to call her husband, but he wasn't at the desk at the time of the phone call. Instead, she left him a frantic message on his answering machine, telling him that it was an emergency. At this point, the police had been in the neighborhood for a week, ever since the disappearance of 8-year-old Maddie Clifton. In fact, she knew that all she needed to do was step outside to find a policeman. Can you imagine being put in that situation? Knowing that you were about to send your own son to prison and change the lives of so many people forever. In an account later shared by Melissa, she said that as she walked out of her house, she looked over at the Clifton house and knew that they still kept some level of hope for their daughter. Now, those hopes were about to be dashed. After finding an officer further up the street, the distraught mother explained what she had discovered in her son's room. He then called for detectives who met her at the house. Melissa was told to stay on the porch while detectives searched the family home. Just a few moments later, while sobbing and praying that she somehow got things wrong, Melissa was told that it was true that the body of Maddie had been under her son's bed for a week. Melissa was taken to the police station, with her husband returning to the house after hearing the frantic message left by his wife. Before he could even pull into the driveway, the police intercepted him and took him to the police station. According to Melissa, she stayed in the fetal position all the way to the police station, trying to make sense of the confusion and chaos that suddenly had dropped on her. Josh had been in geography class at school when he was called to the office and met by 2 detectives who arrested the 14-year-old on suspicion of murder. Once at the police station, Josh was taken alone to a questioning room. After his father, Steve, had been questioned, he was allowed to be with his son. On entering the room, his father asked the young killer if he knew why he was there, to which Josh replied he had no idea. That is when Steve calmly told him, "Your mom found Maddie in your room." Josh's mother claims that Josh was interviewed a total of 5 times without his father or lawyer being present. He also made a statement admitting to the crime but never signed an official confession. The police once told his mother, Melissa, that it was an open and shut case, which, considering all of the details, it really was. Once the media caught on to the development in the case, journalists and TV crews swarmed the house. Detectives investigated the house for a full week after the discovery. They discovered blood splatters on the ceiling fan in Josh's room. The strange thing about the corpse being in the house all that time was that Josh's dog didn't sniff out the decomposition. In fact, a cadaver dog had been outside Josh's open bedroom window for 2 days before the discovery of Maddie and didn't smell the body. Some have concluded that it was the water mattress and Josh lying on it to seal it around the body that was responsible for the smell not escaping. Also, the Phillips' house had been searched by a half a dozen officers previously, as all houses in the neighborhood were. In fact, Josh's house had been searched 3 times. Before Melissa and Steve could break the news to their family that their son was the killer of an 8-year-old girl, CNN and other national news agencies beat them to it by plastering Josh's picture all over the newspapers and TV screens across America. In the town's local paper, the Florida Times-Union, photographs of the Phillips family home were published along with a full address and map of the neighborhood. This made the media and public frenzy intensify further and put the spotlight on a boy who was once described as quiet and kind. Josh Phillips had had a long history of appealing his sentence. In 2002, an appeals court upheld Phillips' conviction and denied him parole. In 2004, Josh's mother, Melissa, began to seek a new trial for her son, stating that his young age at the time should have been more of a factor in the harsh sentencing. In 2008, two of the officials behind his original sentence, State Attorney Harry Shorstein and Sheriff Nat Glover, stated that they believed that Josh deserved a jail sentence, but admitted to having second thoughts about the no parole life sentence for a 14-year-old child. In 2012, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that sentencing juveniles to life in prison without parole is completely unconstitutional. In November 2015, Josh's attorneys considered the Supreme Court ruling as a basis to file a resentencing hearing, and in September 2016, he successfully appealed to the court. Josh was granted a new sentencing hearing, and in June 2017, after hearing Maddie's mother plead for the sentence to be upheld, Josh was resentenced to life in prison, only this time with the eligibility for parole in 2023. This of course doesn't mean that he will be granted freedom in 2023, but it does mean that his attorney has put the chance of putting the case forward that 35 years behind bars should be enough for a teenager who didn't fully understand his actions. Of course, most people's response to that would be, why did Josh finish poor Maddie off with a knife after realizing he had a second chance of letting the girl live? Fear or no fear of his father, the boy would have known that murder is amongst the worst things a person can do. Far worse than having friends over when his parents weren't home.
Up next is the case of the 13-year-old who murdered his favorite teacher. If you are in or have been through the school system, then you must understand just how much the last day of school means to the average student. The final classes, mini parties, and even pranks just make the end of the year all the more special. That said, it is not difficult to understand Nathaniel's frustration when he was sent home from school because he was caught throwing water balloons. Of course, he wasn't the only one involved in the act, but other students were quicker and managed to get away before they can get into any trouble. What's worse, Nathaniel did not get to bid his girlfriend a proper goodbye before he went home for the summer. Unfortunately, the anger Nathaniel harbored toward the member of staff who had sent him home eventually manifest against Nathaniel's favorite teacher in the most unreasonable and unspeakable way. Nathaniel Brazil was born on the 22nd of September 1986 to parents Polly Powell and Nathaniel Brazil Sr. From the tender age of 5, Nathaniel had witnessed his mother being domestically abused by her former husbands and boyfriends. It is not certain when his parents separated, but by the time of the murder, Nathaniel was living with his mother, a 2-year-old sister, and his mother's then husband. Nathaniel's father, on the other hand, was said to be living in Daytona Beach and having very limited interactions with his son. According to reports, Nathaniel Brazil Sr. sent Polly $50 every week, presumably for his son's upkeep. Despite the less than ideal circumstances surrounding Nathaniel's upbringings, he was an honor student with an excellent attendance and no history of violence or discipline problems. Nathaniel attended Lake Worth Middle School in Lake Worth, Florida. For the most part, teachers described him as being soft-spoken, bright, and well-liked. Of these teachers who spoke highly of him, Nathaniel's favorite was his language arts teacher, Barry Grunow. While he was an all-around A student, the 7th grade seemed to have been quite a challenge for Nathaniel. Whether or not this was due to his situation at home is unclear, but Nathaniel's academic record showed that his grades had significantly dropped over the school year. To further highlight this, Investigations revealed on the 15th of April 2000, just about a month before the tragic event, Nathaniel had written a letter to Barry. In the letter, the teenager explained how his 7th grade year had been a significantly difficult period for him. He complained about being picked on by his classmates and teachers, and even contemplated committing suicide. Barry had been known to stand up for Nathaniel and encouraged him when others made fun of him for his passion for studying and academic excellence. This must have contributed a great deal to the 13-year-old finding a safe space and confidence in his teacher. Of course, being at the start of his teenage life, there was something else in the mix of Nathaniel's schoolwork and home life. Yes, hormones. Testimonies from some of Nathaniel's friends revealed that he had developed feelings for one of his classmates, Gonzalez. Denora had been Nathaniel's first girlfriend, giving him his first kiss, which would eventually turn out to be their last, just 6 days before things went horribly wrong. Born on the 6th of July, 1964, Barry Grunow was a Detroit native whose father died when he was young. He grew up in a working-class household in the Cabana Colony neighborhood near Palm Beach Gardens. With his height of 6'3" and his decent athletic abilities, Barry earned all-conference basketball honors at Jupiter High, where he studied. In what could be said to be an unfortunate hindsight, Barry had granted an interview to the Post as a freshman at Florida Atlantic University. The interview was for a 1986 Labor Day story about people's worst jobs. In the interview, the then 25-year-old spoke about why he quit his summer job as a convenience store clerk just 2 weeks into the role. "You're there for 8 hours," he said in the interview. "Any minute, a killer could come in and gun me between the eyes." Little did he know that sooner, rather than later, he would meet a similar fate. By the time of the interview, Barry had begun dating Pamela Halauka, a former special education teacher. Barry finished university in 1987 and was employed as an English teacher at Loggers Run Middle School, west of Boca Raton. Barry and Pamela eventually got married in 1991 when he was 27 years old. The couple had 2 children and lived on North O Street in Lake Worth. According to several reports, Barry Grunow was not only a dedicated teacher who took his job seriously, but he was also a loving father. He was deeply loved by his wife and children. On the 26th of May 2000, Nathaniel Brazil left home for the last day of school with a small bouquet of orange and white flowers and a silver balloon in his hands. Yes, you guessed right. These items were for his girlfriend, Denora. Nathaniel planned to give them to her just before his first lesson. As it turns out, the gifts for Denora were not the only unconventional items Nathaniel took to school on that fateful day. Hidden in the youngster's backpack were water balloons. It was the last day of school, and Nathaniel was determined to make the most of it. After attending his language arts class with Mr. Grunow and having his lunch, Nathaniel went to band practice, where he played the tuba. After his next lesson, Nathaniel made a stop at the bathroom to fill up the water balloons he had brought to school. Soon, he was part of a group of about 12 students who were involved in a water fight. While it was the last day of school, the teachers were not willing to condone any bad behavior, and so they immediately set out to catch the students involved. As expected, everyone involved in the water fight dispersed at the sight of a counselor. Everyone but Nathaniel and a 13-year-old girl, that is. Being the only ones found on the scene, the 2 were sent home as punishment. In line with the punishment that had been given to them, both students left the school, but Nathaniel was not happy about the development. The 13-year-old girl who was sent home alongside Nathaniel later revealed that Nathaniel had promised to return to the school and harm the counselor who had sent them home. According to the girl, Nathaniel had said something along the lines of, "Just watch, I'll be all over the news." And what is more horrifying is that the teenager kept to his word. The previous weekend, Nathaniel had visited Boynton Beach, where a man who he regarded as his grandfather lived. While at the beach home, Nathaniel snatched a .25 caliber Raven semi-automatic handgun and some loose bullets that were stored in a drawer. What interest would a 13-year-old have in such an item, you may ask? Well, Nathaniel had been fascinated by the possibility of a career in law enforcement, so he was very interested in guns. He had taken the old man's gun to inspect it and figure out how it worked. Unfortunately, his plan went a little too well. After being sent home from school, Nathaniel retrieved the gun and hid it in his pocket. He then returned to school on his bicycle. His sole mission? To tell his girlfriend a proper goodbye before the start of the summer holidays. Or, at least, that is what it seemed like at first glance. Once at school, Nathaniel went in search of Denora and her friend. It so happened that they were both in a lesson with Mr. Grunow at that time of the day, 3:25 p.m. Undeterred by this, Nathaniel walked into Grunow's class and asked to see the two girls. Security cameras capture Mr. Grunow speaking with Nathaniel outside of the classroom. Grunow, unaware that Nathaniel had been sent home, most likely asked him for a hall pass and told him that he could not see the girls. Surprisingly, this was not what provoked Nathaniel. According to Nathaniel, Mr. Grunow was laughing, which made him mad. Supposedly, Grunow's laughter enraged Nathaniel to the point that he pulled out a gun. A few seconds later, students in Mr. Grunow's class heard him say, "Stop pointing that gun at me, Nate." Everyone was alarmed, even Nathaniel himself. According to him, he had been shaking uncontrollably in the standoff with his teacher. Then, as 14-year-old Mark Ariat later put it, there was a big pop, and Grunow dropped dead in front of a row of lockers. In the blink of an eye, students came running out of the class shouting, "He shot Mr. Grunow!" He really had. Having taken a bullet to his head, Grunow now lay dead in a pool of his own blood. Dazed by what had happened in the last few minutes, Nathaniel did the only thing he could hear his body telling him to do. Run. And run he did. As Nathaniel raced down the hallway, John James, a mathematics teacher who had also taught Nathaniel, stepped out of his classroom to see the commotion that was going on. Not wanting anything or anyone to get in his way, Nathaniel waved the gun at James, warning him that he was not afraid to use it by saying the words, "Don't bother me, Mr. James." Realizing that the threat was real, the math teacher quickly backed up into his classroom with his hands raised, and Nathaniel made his escape. Once outside the building, Nathaniel discovered that his bike had been moved from where he had left it. He ran across the school compound, jumped over the fence, and was racing down the street when a police car came around. Nathaniel flagged down the car and recognized the driver as Officer Mike Mahoney, whom he knew from his neighborhood. Dropping to his knees beside the officer, Nathaniel confessed, "I shot somebody." A few hours later, Nathaniel asked detectives how Grunow was faring. When told that his teacher had died, Nathaniel broke down sobbing. When Nathaniel had not returned home from school by 3:30 p.m. that afternoon, Holly grew worried. What could have happened to her son? She would find out 30 minutes later when her sister called to deliver the news. Nathaniel had been arrested. A while later, when Polly arrived at the interrogation room where her son was being held, the teenager began to weep and shake. Polly wiped the tears from her son's face. "If I taught you anything, didn't I teach you to think first?" she asked him in tears. Barry Grunow's death was tragic, not only for the school and students who greatly admired him, but for a number of other people. His death signaled the creation of a void in at least 3 people's lives: his wife and 2 children, who were aged 4 and 9 years old at the time of his death. According to Ben Marlin, the then Palm Beach County School Superintendent, Pamela Grunow kept asking the question why repeatedly when he had gone down to the Grunow home on a condolence visit. This loss was tragic in that it not only affected Grunow's immediate family, but rippled the rest of the community. Since Grunow was liked and admired by all, it's little wonder that many people were devastated by the news of his death. When asked about his teacher, Nathaniel said, "I liked the way he interacted with us and other students, the way he played basketball, and he hung out with us. As far as we were in class, he just sat back and talked to us. Gruno's likability made it less surprising when about 1,600 people showed up for his memorial service. While grieving her deceased husband, Pamela Gruno was committed to doing a lot more than hosting a memorial service in memory of him. She sued the pawn shop that had sold the gun to Nathaniel's grandfather and the Palm Beach County School Board. These cases were settled out of court for over $1 million, but Pam did not stop there. She went ahead to sue the company that made the gun and won a ruling of $1.2 million. However, an appeals court rejected the ruling, concluding that the gun was anything but defective. With the money she received from court settlements, Pamela started a foundation that gave scholarships and support to students, continuing the life work and dream of her husband. On the other side of the coin, Nathaniel's world seemed to be crashing down. Just months after he was arrested, Nathaniel's mother, Polly, found out that she had breast cancer. Regardless, Polly refused to give up on her son. So in 2003, she mustered all the strength she could and went, in the company of other parents of teenagers who had committed murder, to see the Vatican to try to change the US practice of trying teenagers as adults. In 2008, a now 43-year-old Polly died of breast cancer. With his father cutting off all communications with him, Nathaniel was left without any immediate family. I know you're probably wondering about what I just said. Yes, Nathaniel was tried as an adult. After his arrest, the then Palm Beach County State Attorney decided to try Nathaniel as an adult on the charges of first-degree murder. This was not uncommon at the time, as there were about 15 teenagers who had been convicted of first-degree murder. Florida and other states adopted this method of trying teenagers as adults to obtain the highest possible punishment and manage the spike in juvenile crime rates. Robert Udell, Nathaniel's defense attorney, was not swayed and stayed true to his belief that Nathaniel should not get sentenced to life in prison or the death sentence. According to Robert, Nathaniel was one of the finest men I ever met in my 30 years of practice. Robert stuck to the argument that Nathaniel had only brought the gun to school to intimidate people and ended up killing Gruno by accident. Nathaniel himself agreed, as he mentioned in a future interview that his first mistake was stealing the gun from his grandfather in the first place. On the 16th of May 2001, after hours of deliberation, the jury found Nathaniel guilty of second-degree murder and aggravated assault for waving the gun at Mr. James. He was sentenced to 28 years in a state prison, followed by 7 years probation. Considering the living circumstances in prison, Nathaniel may have been negatively influenced. Prison records show about 15 instances of disciplinary action, although mostly for minor offenses like lying or disrespecting an official and violating of telephone and mail privileges. He was cited for 3 major violence-related offenses over the span of 14 years, but only admitted to the first, which was for fighting back in 2001, claiming that the others were fabricated. In search of proper treatment while in prison, Nathaniel filed 7 lawsuits and submitted 500 administrative complaints against the prison system. One of the lawsuits has been settled. This does not come as a surprise, as while still in prison, Nathaniel maintained his reputation as an exemplary student. He has continued to study hard. He earned his general education diploma and passed other examinations, certifying him as a law clerk and as a paralegal. This most likely informed his knowledge about the law and his rights, in addition to the support received from his legal team. Nathaniel has regretted not being able to attend the funeral services of both Mr. Gruno and his mother, as he was in prison and was not granted leave. He says he has already petitioned the state senator to allow him to attend the funeral ceremony of his maternal grandmother when she dies. However, it is likely that Nathaniel's petition will never be granted, as he told his grandmother that she needs to, in his words, live to be 115 so she can see me become the first lawyer in our family. On his way to a career in law enforcement, Nathaniel is being held at the Jackson Correctional Institution. His release date is set for the 18th of May 2028 when he will be 41 years old. The unfortunate events leading to the death of Barry Grunow have caused many people to share their different opinions on Nathaniel's sentence. While some people think that it is a good thing that after the completion of his 28 years, Nathaniel will be given another shot at life, others believe that he should have been subject to the full extent of the law, seeing how his actions caused so much trauma to those who witnessed the event. And of course, Grunow having lost his life, and his children growing up without their father. What do you think? Do you believe Nathaniel should have gotten the life sentence? Or are you of the opinion that he deserves another shot at life? Up next is the case of Joseph, the 10-year-old killer. Joseph Hall's story is a tragic one. His case has brought up a complicated set of questions that have yet to be answered. What happens when a child is exposed to a life of such destruction? How should the justice system respond to this kind of tragic situation? In today's video, we will explore the tragic case of Joseph Hall and the questions that arise from it. We will look at how Joseph's upbringing shaped his life and his actions, and what his case says about the criminal justice system. We're going to dive into a case where a small child's innocence was replaced by violence. Joseph was born on June 19, 2000, to Jeffrey Hall and his ex-wife, Latika Neal, in Riverside, California. Jeffrey raised his children Joseph and Shirley after his ex-wife lost custody owing to her neglect and erratic behavior. And after Neal, he had remarried and went on to have 3 more children. Jeffrey was a plumber and faced a lot of financial problems as he struggled to get a job during an economic downturn in California. Real estate was hit the most. He struggled to provide for such a huge family, but he had one place where he felt important and like a leader. He was a prominent figure in the white supremacist movement, as he believed that his job loss and financial problems were because of Jews and non-whites taking up the jobs. He was the regional leader of the National Social Movement, or the NSM, also known as the Nazi Party. The National Socialist Movement became the largest neo-Nazi organization in the country, with 46 chapters in 20 states. In October 2009, Jeffrey Hall led a rally near a day labor site in Riverside. The people wore World War II-era Nazi garments. Later, in an interview, Jeffrey said, "They're proud of who they are, tired of white guilt being shoved on their kids and multiculturalism. They can't see any reason for it." Jeff would often hold meetings with members at his home in the presence of his kids. The meetings were full of all kinds of slogans against non-whites and other hate speech. Due to Jeff's joblessness, he had become increasingly violent with his son and his wife, Krista McCary. He would often beat them up. According to Joseph's stepmother, Krista, Jeffrey punished his son every day for being too loud or for getting in his way. He would punch and kick the little child several times in the back. So, what did Joseph's life look like? He was reportedly very aggressive and verbally abusive from a very young age. His behavior began to spiral out of control, so much so that Joseph had been expelled from 6 schools for harming students and teachers. At age 5, Joseph had stabbed a teacher with a pencil during his first day in kindergarten, and had also tried to strangle a teacher with a phone cord later. Joseph reportedly suffered from ADHD, and after switching so many schools, eventually he had to be homeschooled. According to his grandmother, Joseph had been like this from the very beginning. While that might be true, the home's hateful atmosphere that included Jeff's regular violence with Joseph and the NSM meetings definitely added to Joseph's aggression. In fact, Joseph was exposed to drugs and alcohol even before he was born, in his mother's womb. Latika Neal reportedly consumed heroin, meth, LSD, marijuana, and alcohol when she was pregnant. And during childhood, Joseph had witnessed his father's discriminatory behavior on a regular basis. A young Joseph had no guidance, and the only example he had was a violent father who was promoting hate. Joseph Hall was a troubled child who had a history of violence and mental health issues. He began to display increasingly volatile behavior. perhaps due to his mental illnesses and his father's neo-Nazi beliefs. One simply couldn't imagine the events that would unfold next. This violent and hateful environment was unknowingly brewing a murderer. Jeffrey Hall was killed, and his own son Joseph was the killer. Just a few days before tragedy struck, Jeffrey Hall bragged to his NSM group about teaching his oldest son Joseph to use night vision equipment and to shoot a gun. Jeffrey had no idea that this very training would be used to kill him. On May 1st, 2011, 32-year-old Jeffrey returned home from a neo-Nazi gathering and was allegedly drunk. He slept on the couch. Later, during the wee hours, Joseph retrieved a revolver from his father's room and returned to the couch where Jeff was sleeping, where he fatally shot him in his head, behind his left ear at point-blank range. Upon hearing the gunshot, Hall's wife, Krista, woke up and rushed to the scene to see a profusely bleeding and unresponsive Jeff, and Joseph with the revolver in his hand. Joseph said, "I shot Dad." She immediately called 911 and reported that Joseph had shot Jeff.
My son shot my husband. I need an ambulance. He's bleeding.
How old is your son?
10.
How old is your son?
10. Oh my God.
Jeff was dead. According to reports and Joseph's statement, the night before his murder, Jeffrey Hall had threatened to remove all the smoke detectors and burn down the family's house while the family was sleeping. Was that what prompted a young Joseph to kill his father? The little boy knew that he had shot his father, but it's unclear whether he fully understood that he had done something wrong. While in the police car, Joseph had told the officers that he shot Jeffrey Hall because he had repeatedly beat him and other family members. Joseph was taken into custody for interrogation. During the interrogation, authorities found out that Child Protective Services had issued 23 reports of alleged abuse, neglect, and poor living conditions at Hall's residence. But according to court reports, these accusations didn't amount to anything. However, after Jeff's murder, when the police officers arrived at Hall's home, they found dirty clothes lying around and empty beer bottles all over the place. The bathroom had a pungent smell of urine, and the pillows, mattresses, and blankets were all soiled and dirty. There were no boundaries in that house. Weapons like the .357 Magnum Joseph used to murder Hall were easily accessible to the children. The revolver Joseph used to kill his father was recovered under Joseph's bed. He had hidden it there after killing Jeffrey. Reportedly, a .22 caliber rifle was also found in the garage leaning against a wall. There was also an unlocked cabinet that had some ammunition and many other weapons. It's not just about easy access to weapons. As if that wasn't bad enough, at just 10 years old, Joseph actually knew how to use these weapons. Jeffrey sometimes took Joseph to the Mexican border, where heavily armed members of the neo-Nazi group often patrolled to catch illegal immigrants. According to court reports, that's where Jeff taught his son how to shoot. It's crazy to see how Jeff had no sense of what to keep from his son. Instead, it seems like he gladly taught his son the art of inflicting violence. Joseph's interrogation lasted more than an hour. During the interrogation, 10-year-old Joseph was asked why he killed his father, to which he said he was motivated by an episode of Criminal Minds, where he saw a kid shoot his abusive father and did not face any consequences for it. Joseph also thought that his father wouldn't really die. He thought he would recover and that the two of them would eventually be able to reconcile. While interrogating the 10-year-old, the authorities quickly realized that he didn't actually understand the gravity of the situation or the depravity of his crime. There are a lot of mixed reactions to the way in which the interrogation was conducted. Although the crime was heinous, the fact also is that a 10-year-old can't be expected to understand the importance of the Miranda warning during interrogation. For those of you who don't know what a Miranda warning is, here's the exact wording. You have the right to remain silent and refuse to answer questions. If you give up the right to remain silent, anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. We have all heard this before the authorities start interrogating any suspect or culprit. A 10-year-old boy will not understand this and can't really be expected to know the importance of staying silent in a situation like this. Because of this, Joseph went on answering whatever he was asked. He didn't know the consequences that would follow. Here's a part of what Joseph said. "I wasn't really thinking about if he was gonna die or get unconscious," he said. "I just thought maybe he might learn a lesson. I was trying to get him to know how I feel when I get hurt. Then maybe we could go back to being friends and start all over." This shows that the boy didn't really think murder, but his mind only allowed him to understand the taking revenge part of it by hurting his father. Joseph was told enough to understand cause and effect, action and consequence. According to court records, the defense team tried to raise this major issue during the trial. When Joseph was asked what "you have the right to remain silent" meant, he thought that it meant that he had the right to stay calm. When he was asked what "anything you say will be used against you in a court of law" meant, he didn't respond. When he was asked what "you have the right to talk to a lawyer and have a lawyer with you" meant, he couldn't explain it properly. Court records also note that a Riverside police detective who was in charge of this investigation did not read Miranda warnings to Joseph until about 2 minutes into the interrogation. After each sentence, the officer asked Joseph if he understood what it meant. However, Joseph, who was all of 10, couldn't understand anything properly, and the officer had to explain to him what the sentences meant each time. Another loophole in the interrogation was the role of Joseph's stepmother who was with him. When the detectives left the room for a break after about 45 minutes of interrogating Joseph, the boy's stepmother was recorded telling Joseph that he didn't have to talk to the officer if he didn't want to. She also added, "But it's good that you told the truth." The stepmother's husband was murdered by his own son Joseph. Why was she present during the interrogation? She had a conflict of interest, which could affect how she guided Joseph. And it so happened that, ironically or not, Krista McCary, the stepmother, did become a prosecution witness against Joseph during the trial. The boy finally told the police how he picked up the revolver from his dad's room and shot him in the middle of the night. He was then arrested and taken to juvenile hall, while Jeffrey Hall's other 4 children were taken into protective custody. Joseph's stepmother Krista was also arrested later and charged with criminal storage of firearms and child neglect. Joan Patterson, Jeff's mother and Joseph's grandmother, was given temporary custody of the other 4 children. In an interview on 60 Minutes, she said that she wasn't surprised about Joseph killing his father. She had anticipated it because of how violent Joseph was and how Jeffrey was abusive toward him. But she didn't expect it to happen so soon. She thought it would happen when Joseph grew older. According to her, Jeff becoming a neo-Nazi had hastened it. Joseph's trial began in 2013 after he had already spent about 18 months in juvenile hall. It was a difficult task for Chief District Attorney Mike Socho, as Joseph was a young child and didn't only have age to his advantage in the case, but also had people's sympathy. And Jeffrey Hall being a neo-Nazi might have put the little boy slightly into the hero category for some people. Socho was moved too, as he hadn't ever tried a child before, especially not for murder. But because a murder is a murder and a case is a case that has to be looked at as objectively as possible, Socho had to put across his points. According to Socho, Jeff's Nazism had nothing to do with the case. Socho said that Joseph would have shot his father even if he'd been a member of the Peace and Freedom Party. This implied that Joseph killed his father for his own reasons, not for some greater good or anything. Joseph, no matter how young, is in fact a murderer. The defense too had a very solid response. The defense, Matthew Hardy, cited Joseph's motives as being protective in nature. Joseph did what he did to save his family from Jeff's violence. He also insisted that Nazism can't be completely dismissed to this case and was relevant when it came to assessing Jeff's only son. According to him, Joseph's childhood environment and conditioning matter in this case. He emphasized that kids learn from their parents, and when Jeff was talking about hate speech and Nazism at home, he became a role model for Joseph. Joseph showed no emotion. Socho played the 911 call made by Krista at 4:02 a.m. on that Sunday morning in 2011, where she said, "My stepson shot my husband. He's bleeding. Hearing this call distressed Joseph a little bit in the courtroom. While both sides had strong arguments to make, the case was very, very difficult. Had it been an adult in place of Joseph, it would have been much easier, as an adult has an understanding of what's right and wrong, and no other major factors can defend a cold-blooded murder like this. But Joseph, being just 10 years old, gave the defense equal weight. Had an adult committed this crime, they would get 40 years to life in prison. But in the case of Joseph, what kind of a sentence can one expect? According to California law, Joseph can only be held until he turns 23. Eventually, after all sorts of arguments in court, and to much disappointment for a lot of people, Judge Leonard issued the sentence. Although Joseph was 13 at the time of the trial and 10 at the time of committing the crime itself had a lot of weight, and so Joseph was convicted of second-degree murder in the killing of his father, Jeffrey Hall. He was sentenced to 40 years to life, but since he wasn't an adult, the sentence would actually be 10 years in a California juvenile facility. Joseph would be released when he was 23 years old. Here's what the judge had to say before handing out the sentence. "I know some will be sad about my decision, and there may be some tears." That was the end of the case, but it wasn't the end of a fight for better rights and protection for children in such cases. 5 years after Jeffrey Hall's death, California legislators introduced a bill that would provide children with some layer of protection from police interrogation. This new bill came into existence because of Joseph's case. Unlike some states, California doesn't have a law that requires young children to receive legal guidance from an attorney or a guardian before they're interrogated. This Senate Bill 1052 was introduced in February 2016 and could potentially affect hundreds of children like Joseph who enter the criminal justice system at a young age. According to the Senate Bill 1052, children younger than 18 years of age will first consult with an attorney or a legal guardian before being allowed to waive their Miranda rights, and also before they're interrogated by authorities. Joseph was a mentally harassed child all throughout his childhood and lived with his abusive neo-Nazi father. But does it mean that killing someone is all right, even if he was just 10 years old at the time? Whether the sentencing was fair will always be debatable. While this case was tragic in many ways, it brought to light many things, like the Senate Bill 1052, which will at least provide better handling of such cases where everything from interrogation and trial to sentencing becomes challenging. Moreover, the case also throws light on identifying mental health problems in kids and assessing the environment children grow up in early on. Joseph was expelled from 6 schools for violent behavior before age 10. What steps did the parents or the school take to identify the problem and help? On the other hand, Jeffrey was a discriminatory person who was the leader of a neo-Nazi movement. He spread hatred and violence against others right in front of his son at home. What example was he setting for little Joseph? Up next is the case of the little girl who murdered a disabled man. Teenagers aren't always what they seem to be. Many of us know that pretty well. Even an innocent-looking kid can become the most ruthless murderer in the right or wrong situation. So was the case of Morgan Leppert, a 15-year-old girl who thought she was in love. While chasing her dream of running away with her Prince Charming, things took a very dark turn. We'll be diving into the unfortunate case of a blue-eyed devil whose boyfriend convinced her to murder an elderly disabled man. Stick with us as we go down the spiral of love and betrayal. On a sunny day in 2008, Morgan Leppert and her much older boyfriend, Toby Lowry, knocked on the door of an elderly man. That elderly man was 66-year-old James Stewart, who was born without hands. When he opened the door, Stewart was understandably confused. What were these kids doing in front of his house? Though no one knew it at the time, he would have never imagined that only 20 minutes later, they would be responsible for his death. Morgan and Toby had knocked on this man's door with one goal in mind: to steal his truck and get out of the state. They wanted to start a life together, a new life together, free from Morgan's parents and free from the people they knew. Nothing was going to stop them. Months ago, Leppert had convinced her mother to allow then 22-year-old Lowry to move into their home. She had lied that Toby Lowry was only 17, making everyone in her family have pity for who they thought was a homeless minor. It was around Christmas time that Morgan's mother had done some investigation of her own. She discovered that her daughter's boyfriend was actually a much older man. Of course, Morgan's mother did the proper thing and kicked out the predator. I mean, seriously? A 22-year-old man dating a 15-year-old girl? Her mother also ordered them to end the relationship, but Morgan would not have it. They continued to date behind her mother's back, and soon enough, she decided to abandon everything at home and travel across the country after Lowry convinced her to. They needed a vehicle to travel. They definitely did not have enough to buy one, so the next best option was to steal one. Toby had been scouting for weeks, and he had the perfect target in mind. However, their plan quickly went out the window as robbery turned into murder. When Stewart opened the door, Leppert began to narrate a story about how her car had broken down. Putting on her helpless teenage girl look, she asked to use Stewart's phone. James Stewart graciously complied, stepping aside to let the blonde-haired teenager and her sketchy companion into his home. On the phone, Morgan Leppert made a call to her own cell phone. This would later prove to be the first of many blunders on that afternoon. The moment Morgan dropped the call, their plan was in action. They cornered the elderly man after knocking him around a little bit. When he resisted, the couple brought out 2 metal rods and began to beat him bloody with them. Somehow, Stewart managed to remain alive despite all of this. Next, Toby Lowry ordered Morgan to stab the man. They stabbed him several times, after which they suffocated him with a plastic bag to make sure the job was complete. After they confirmed he was dead, the couple embraced in excitement. Finally, they thought, they could be together forever. That dream was not going to last long. Karma always catches up. Stewart rotted in his home for a few days before he was found. The moment his body was discovered, an investigation was opened. Police scoured the house for clues to this gruesome murder. Just when they were running out of leads, the most important one came in. The single call Morgan Leppert placed to her phone served as the connection. Her family had filed a missing persons case, and suddenly the police were picking up her trail at the scene of a homicide. An Amber Alert was immediately issued by the media. The images of Toby Lowry and Leppert were all over the news. However, 3 days after the Amber Alert was issued, Morgan Leppert and her lover, Lowry, were apprehended in Texas. They were immediately charged with first-degree murder in the death of 66-year-old James Stewart, according to the Putnam County Sheriff. Leppert and Lowry were captured in El Paso just after 4 p.m. on Saturday after a motorist recognized them from a national news report and called 911. After the Putnam County Sheriff's Office revealed that Morgan Leppert, 15, and Toby Lowry, 22, were suspected of killing a disabled man, the teen's older brother spoke out in his sister's defense. Howard Hunt, Leppert's brother, told Channel 4 that the ordeal had been an emotional roller coaster for the family. Hunt lamented about how some of the bad news stories had been portraying her as something she's not. He passionately told the media how she did not have a violent bone in her body. He even said that she would never harm a mouse. "My sister is young," Hunt said. "She is the type to be easily manipulated. I don't think she was there when allegedly the murder took place." During an afternoon news conference, Putnam County Sheriff Dean Kelly painted a much different picture, saying Leppert acted as a decoy to get into Stewart's home after she and Lowry scouted the man's house and discovered he had hearing problems. Stewart was assaulted with 2 metal rods, stabbed numerous times, and strangled with a plastic bag, according to Kelly. The details of the murder were hidden from the public until investigators had the opportunity to interrogate Lowry and Leppert. Kelly praised the national news media for getting out the Amber Alert information, which resulted in the capture of 2 people now charged with murder. Despite the overwhelming evidence, Hunt was adamant that not only was Lowry the brains behind the whole operation, but also that his sister was a victim who was scared into playing along. He also stated that the authorities had not allowed them to speak with Leppert since her arrest in Texas. The trial was relatively fast. It was even faster for Toby Lowry, who quickly turned on the love of his life after learning he could face the death penalty. When the time came for Leppert's trial, Lowry was already serving a life sentence after pleading guilty to first-degree murder. He even agreed to testify against Leppert, but neither side called on him during the 4-day trial. The jury of 5 men and 1 woman didn't seem to believe her childish appearance and accusations that her adult boyfriend, Toby Lowry, directed the robbery and murder of a disabled man. Lepert was 15 and a runaway from her San Mateo home at the time, when Lowry was 22. Following a first-degree murder decision by a jury, the Putnam County youngster faced an automatic and obligatory life sentence in prison. The self-described redneck cowgirl will be the state of Florida's youngest inmate. She was also found guilty of robbery and burglary. Because of the press attention in Putnam County, the trial was held in Bunnell. Christopher Smith, Lepert's attorney, vowed to appeal on various grounds, including the disclosure of her audio statements to police and the jury consisting of 6 rather than 12 members. He also told Headstorm that he intends to question whether a mandatory life sentence for a juvenile is constitutional in order to preserve that issue for appeal. Smith called no witnesses, but maintained throughout the trial that Lowry directed Lepert to examine the house before returning with him to rob Stewart, and that he never let her out of his sight during their cross-country journey. He also claimed that Lepert's immaturity and obsession with Lowry left her open to the schemes of a man who had already served time in jail for burglary. Smith believes Lepert is the finest example of why the law protects 15-year-old girls from older men. Lepert's attorney claimed at previous hearings to decide the sentencing that the teen was under the influence of her 22-year-old boyfriend and was immature and extremely submissive. She had no previous criminal record. Over and over, she apologized for running away with him, but it was too late. She was also pregnant when she went to prison, but her attorney believes she miscarried. Morgan's relationship with Lowry was sad and terrible, and he was not the man she believed she loved. But it's safe to say 15-year-old girls don't understand what love is, especially if they believe that a 22-year-old man has their best interest at heart. Jurors had the option to find her guilty of lesser crimes such as second or third-degree murder or manslaughter. Smith stated that the prosecutors only proved third-degree murder. He claimed Lepert had no intention of killing Stewart and caused no major injuries when she struck him with an aluminum curtain rod. Even if it were true, the prosecution told jurors she would still be convicted of felony first-degree murder since she was a key participant in the burglary and robbery that led to Stewart's death. In reality, the prosecution argued that Lepert committed planned murder because the strategy centered around her desire to flee, and she did nothing to walk away or prevent the attack. The prosecutor emphasized that Lepert persuaded her mother to let Lowry move in and share her bed when she was only 14 years old. She also dropped out of school after the 8th grade. When her mother discovered Lowry's age and record and kicked him out, Lepert fled with him. When did she ever do what she was told? France, the prosecutor wondered. He claimed her childish appearance and behavior was an act that she put on to achieve what she desired. In prior hearings, prosecutor Chris France maintained that Lepert was in charge, based on observations of a homeless hitchhiker she and Lowry picked up after the murder. This hitchhiker had traveled with them for days. According to Robert Buckner, Lepert smashed Lowry during fights while Lowry was docile toward her. Both Lepert and Stewart's family sobbed as the verdict was read out. Stewart's family turned to thank the investigators. After court, both families denied interviews. According to Gretel Plessinger, a spokeswoman for the Florida Department of Corrections, Lepert was the youngest female inmate when she was convicted. Young women labeled youthful offenders are housed in a special dorm at Lowell Correctional Institute in Ocala, where they are separated from the regular population. Susanna Reid from the TV show Children Who Kill visited Morgan while she was serving a life sentence without the possibility of parole. In the interview, Morgan describes how her boyfriend's connection blinded her. When asked what she would tell her 15-year-old self, Morgan replied, "I wish I wasn't so naive and foolish. I wish I had paid attention. It felt like a nightmare. It was every girl's fantasy to have a boyfriend, and I was the last woman on the planet I expected him to be with. He turned out to be a monster," she said, "and he took my life away from me. What stopped me from running away from him? I was scared of getting killed. So I let him do what he did because I was scared of him. I wish I was smart enough then, like I am now." The interview was interspersed with old police interview tapes, where teenage Morgan can be seen chuckling as she confirms her boyfriend is 22. Asked about the age gap at the time, Morgan said, "He told me he was going to do whatever he had to just to be with me, but I didn't know he was going to take it that far." Her boyfriend escaped the death penalty and received the same life sentence as his 15-year-old girlfriend. Morgan was tried and convicted, but because the United States Supreme Court ruled that minors under the age of 18 cannot be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of release, she was entitled to a resentencing hearing. During the resentencing hearing, a tearful apology and years of good behavior behind bars weren't enough to change a life sentence for Morgan Amanda Lepard. Circuit Judge Patty Christensen sentenced the 23-year-old to life in prison for the killing of 66-year-old James Stewart when she was 15. Lepard admitted to regretting every single decision she made with her then boyfriend that day. "I hope you can find it in your heart to forgive me one day," she said, reading from a lined sheet of notebook paper, her hands shaking at times. The letter was addressed in part to the family of James Thomas Stewart, the victim who was beaten, stabbed, and suffocated in 2008 in order for Lepard and her 22-year-old partner to steal his truck and flee Florida. Stewart's relatives did not attend the hearing. Judge Christensen stated that she had no alternative but to sentence Lepard to life in prison since she truly meant to murder Stewart. Judge Christensen felt compelled to keep the sentence as it was, given the nature of that case. Stewart, who was born without hands, had been dead for several days before his body was discovered. Lepard was also sentenced to 50 years in prison on convictions for burglary with assault and robbery with a deadly weapon. Christensen stated that Lepard's murder sentence will be reviewed in 25 years. She mentioned that Lepard had obtained her high school equivalency and a cosmetology certificate while incarcerated and asked her to maintain good behavior in order to be assisted with evaluation. The judge encouraged her to continue being a good citizen in prison. Being young can make some people feel invincible, but sooner or later karma catches up. Morgan Lepard is another case in the never-ending list of teenagers who will spend the rest of their lives paying for the mistakes that they made in their early years. It is truly sad how many lives can be ruined by just one wrong decision. Up next is the case of John Taylor and what was hiding inside his freezer. While this house seems like the standard Yorkshire home in northern England, something horrific unraveled behind its walls. In fact, it was this very kitchen that the property owner, John Taylor, would freeze the decomposing body of a young girl. After several weeks, the man would wrap her body in a plastic bin bag and attempt to bury it. This was the body of 16-year-old Leanne Tiernan. She was walking alone along a dark, isolated path on the evening of November 26, 2000. The area is known as Hooligill and was less than a mile from her home. After a fun evening of Christmas shopping with her friend, Leanne decided to take a shortcut home. She had no idea that this shortcut would end up cutting her life short. She was abducted and murdered, but it took 8 long months to find her body and find out who the murderer was. It was John Taylor, a 44-year-old delivery driver. John Taylor's neighbors described him as an ordinary man. They felt that they could trust him. Known as the Pet Man, he had many dogs and ferrets. He also sold pet food to people in his neighborhood. He was a divorcee and lived alone. He was fond of hunting from an early age and was often found hunting foxes and pheasants near his house. Nobody knew that it wasn't just those animals he hunted. He was a predator, waiting for an opportunity to hunt down the most vulnerable prey, including young girls. Leanne Tiernan was one of them. It was later found out that he didn't just hunt animals, but tortured them too. He was a sadist who derived pleasure from inflicting pain on animals. He caught and tortured rabbits, and was once seen stabbing a fox repeatedly. Taylor had 2 children, a son and a daughter. Both lived with their mother after Taylor's divorce in 1996. It was also discovered later that Taylor often advertised for female companions. He even traveled across the country to have sex. Knowing these details, suspicions arose that John could have had dangerous and sadistic tendencies. However, he had no previous criminal record, and the only thing he was ever caught for was the theft of a suit when he was 15 years old. On the evening of the 26th of November 2000, Leanne Tiernan was enjoying a good time with her friend Sarah Whitehouse. After their Christmas shopping, the 2 friends took a bus to the suburb of Bramley. The two got off at a stop near Sarah's home, and then Leanne walked off, taking a shortcut to her home. Leanne never reached her destination. Although Leanne had taken the same route through Hooly Gill several times before, this walk back home was her last, on this isolated path where John Taylor lurked in the woods that fateful evening. He grabbed an unsuspecting Leanne from behind and put his hand over her mouth to keep her from making any noise. He then blindfolded her and took her to his home. Once there, he tied her hands behind her back. He took sexual advantage of the poor teenager and then strangled her with her own scarf. Back at Leanne's home, her mother, Sharon Hawkhead, was waiting Leanne's arrival. Leanne's parents were divorced. Leanne had always come back home on time, and it was very unlike her not to respond to her mother's frequent calls. In fact, Leanne's friend Sarah, who was out shopping with her that very evening, called Leanne's home phone at around 5:20 p.m. and was shocked to learn from Sharon that Leanne wasn't home yet. A worried Sharon kept on calling her daughter, but the phone would ring and then get cut off after a few rings. Later on, Sharon called the police at 7 p.m. and reported her daughter missing. Leanne's search became the largest search in West Yorkshire. The authorities left no stone unturned, trying to figure out what really happened to Leanne. The police force searched more than 1,000 properties. They even drained out a 3-mile stretch of a canal to check for a body. Leanne's family made public appeals to find out what happened to their daughter, but all of this gave nothing. No clues, no suspects, no Leanne. During the search for Leanne, more than 1,400 house-to-house inquiries were conducted. The police designated 800 houses along the route where Leanne disappeared as Red Route. The police also searched 800 sheds and garages and 150 commercial premises around Hooly Gill, but sadly, nothing was found. The authorities took another step and sourced DNA samples from 140 men who had been interviewed by the police in connection with Leanne's case. But again, they came to a dead end. Eventually, when there was no lead on the case, on the 4th of December 2000, the police released an E-fit facial composite of a probable suspect who they couldn't locate. They described him as having been seen walking a dog in the Hooly Gill area right before Leanne disappeared. Other descriptions included the specifics of his appearance and what he wore. 5 feet 8 inches tall and of stocky build with a round, reddish face that may have possibly been scarred. Wearing a black woolen hat, a 3/4 length waterproof jacket, and dirty jeans. After 8 long months, Leanne's body was found. It was in Lindley Woods in North Yorkshire. A local walker had discovered the body. It was wrapped in a duvet cover in several sheets of green trash bags. There was a black plastic bag over her head, and a dog collar held that bag in place. Her neck was tied with a plastic cable tie and scarf. Her wrists were also tied up with cable ties. A fingerprint assessment confirmed it was indeed Leanne Tiernan. A 16-year-old girl who had an entire life ahead of her was found in a horrific manner. It was clear to the authorities now that she had been abducted and killed. They had already lost too much time, and they knew that they'd have to look for clues and suspects as quickly as possible. They needed to act fast. The post-mortem examination of Leanne's body revealed that the degree of decomposition of the body was inconsistent with the burial in the grounds. This means that the killer had recently buried the body and had kept the body somewhere else for all those months. The authorities conducted a fingertip search of the dense woodland where Leanne's body was found and expanded this to cover an area of 20,000 square meters. The public appeal was helpful, and John Taylor's name came to light. He was a poacher from Bramley who knew both the areas well, Bramley and Lindley Woods. The pet man quickly became a person of interest and a suspect in the case, as Leanne's neck was tied with a dog collar. The authorities tracked all of the people in Bramley who had bought dog collars that matched the one found on Leanne's body. More than 100 pet shops and suppliers were contacted in the process. The computerized records of one dog collar company led investigators to John Taylor. From the Bramley area, John Taylor had purchased several of those dog collars. Another solid clue was the fact that John Taylor worked at Parcel Force. According to authorities and further investigations, it was found that the cable ties found on Leanne's body were exclusive to Parcel Force's parent company, Royal Mail. When the authorities searched John's home, they found the same type of cable ties and dog collars that were found on Leanne's body. There was no escape for John anymore. All the clues pointing directly at him. But even more evidence was needed to tie John directly to the case. The knitted scarf found around Leanne's neck contained human hair in the knot. Forensic experts used mitochondrial DNA testing, as initial regular DNA testing was inconclusive. With the help of this mitochondrial DNA testing, the authorities were able to deduce a DNA profile, and it was a match to Taylor. The work on this case is truly commendable because they found evidence of Leanne's presence in John's house too. The forensics team had found a strand of pink carpet fiber on the jumper that Leanne was wearing when she was found. Now, although Taylor had removed and destroyed all of his carpet in an attempt to evade more suspicion, this strand of pink fiber matched the small bits of carpet fibers found on a nail in Taylor's house. The Forensic Science Service team was also able to determine that Leanne had been in Taylor's garden right before she was murdered. She had distinctive types of pollen in her nasal cavity and on her skin and hair. That's the extent to which the investigation team went in order to solve Leanne's case and put Taylor behind bars. After 10 long months since Leanne's disappearance, everything was finally coming to a close. John Taylor was arrested on the 16th of October 2001. He was charged with Leanne's abduction and murder. He was taken to a Leeds police station for questioning. Back at his home, the investigators dug up Taylor's garden and found the bodies of 28 ferrets and 4 dog skeletons. Detective Superintendent Gregg was assigned to Leanne's case, and after seeing the evidence of violence against animals, he commented, "Taylor appears to have been an ordinary man, but he is not. He has a dangerous, extremely dangerous nature. This is displayed in the way in which he treated animals throughout his life." During the investigation after Taylor's arrest, the authorities interrogated Taylor's ex-girlfriends. They revealed a lot about Taylor's sexually violent nature. According to his previous girlfriends, Taylor loved tying up women and had unusual fantasies that involved sadomasochistic sex. One of his ex-girlfriends also made a shocking claim that Taylor had expressed his desire to have sex with the woman's 15-year-old daughter. After this interrogation and all of the evidence, it became clear to the West Yorkshire Police that Tiernan was not Taylor's first victim. The authorities went through previous missing persons and murder cold case files to check if Taylor had a role in those crimes too. One of the first cases was from 1992, the murder of Yvonne Fitt, who was a prostitute from Bradford. Like Leanne, her body was found in a shallow grave in the same woodland. There were 3 other cases the authorities were focusing on. Lindsay Jo Reimer, who disappeared in 1994, Deborah Wood, whose body was found in 1996, and Rebecca Hull, whose body was found in an alley in Bradford in 2001. Could he be involved in the sad end of these women too? As for Leanne's case, Taylor pleaded guilty on the 8th of July 2002, which was the first day of his trial. During sentencing, the judge described the crime as cold and as calculating an act as can be imagined. He told Taylor that he was a dangerous sexual sadist who should expect to spend the rest of his life in custody. Taylor's trial, which was held at the Leeds Crown Court in 2002 and presided over by Honorable Mr. Justice Astill, defense lawyer Graham Stowe Bateson represented John Taylor. Despite direct evidence, including a DNA match with Taylor's hair found in the knitted scarf around Leanne's neck and her blood found in his home, among other things, Taylor still only admitted to kidnapping Leanne. In court, he maintained that he didn't kill her. His side of the story was absolutely bizarre and made no sense. According to Taylor, Leanne had fallen off his bed and banged her head. When this happened, Taylor panicked and had lifted her up using the scarf that was around her neck. According to him, This is when Leanne must have died. Then he was alarmed by this whole incident and buried her body in Lindley Woods. Previously in the video, we talked about the results of Leanne's post-mortem examination. The results concluded that the degree of decomposition of her body was not consistent with the burial in the grounds for so many months. This is where Taylor was caught lying, when he said he immediately buried the body after she fell from his bed and died via accidental strangulation because of her scarf. A cryobiology expert who examined Leanne's body and her cardiac tissue concluded that the body had been kept frozen for some time. Based on this post-mortem report, the judge concluded that Taylor had kept Leanne's body with him for some time, between 3 weeks and 9 months. This is possible to do without causing decomposition only if the body is kept in a deep freeze. Why did he do that? Some deranged killers do this as they think it's a trophy. This could be the case with Taylor too, or another reason could be to avoid detection for such a long time. In such cases, killers wait for a case and the news around it to die down before burying the body. During sentencing, judges still said to Taylor, "You are a dangerous sexual sadist. Your purpose in kidnapping this young girl was so that you could satisfy your perverted cravings. This was a planned, premeditated encounter. It was a cold and calculating act, and the suffering you caused was immeasurable." Prosecutor Robert Smith clarified that, according to the state in which Tierman's body was found, it wasn't possible to prove for sure whether or not she had been sexually abused. But Smith claimed that Taylor's motive for killing her was sexual gratification. All of the other evidence pointed toward that. Knowing Taylor's history and hearing his ex-girlfriend's statements, it was clear that he was a violent, sexual predator. Taylor was found guilty and was charged with Leanne's abduction and murder on July 8, 2002. He was sentenced to 2 life sentences. He showed no remorse. It was a bone-chilling scene in the courtroom. He had a straight face, as if it was just another normal day. But Leanne's family finally had closure, and the crowd felt that justice was served, as this monster was not ever getting out of jail. Judges still concluded that Taylor would have to serve 25 years before being considered for parole, which was later reduced to 20 years by Lord Wolfe CJ. However, seeing the magnitude of his crimes and his remorseless attitude, it seems like Taylor will spend the rest of his life behind bars. Parole doesn't seem likely for him. Taylor was sent to Wakefield Prison, which is a maximum security prison. This famous prison also houses many famous criminals, including Ian Huntley, Roy Whiting, and Harold Shipman. And that's not where Taylor's criminal record stopped. In fact, because of the investigation into Leanne's murder, his DNA solved a few other cases. In February 2003, Taylor was convicted of 2 sexual crimes he had committed in 1988 and 1989 in Bramley. The first one occurred on Hooley Guild. That's the same place where Taylor abducted Leanne. The second one occurred in March 1989. Taylor attacked a young mother while she was home alone with her 18-month-old daughter. John Taylor pleaded guilty in both cases and received 2 more life sentences. On the 3rd of April 2003, Honorable Norman Jones sentenced Taylor to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole for at least 30 years. This slims down his chances of parole further. It became evident to authorities after seeing the manner in which he abducted and killed Leanne Tiernan that this wasn't his first crime. It was well planned and calculated. He even froze the body for months before disposing of it, which means there's a very high probability that he has committed such crimes before. Leanne Tiernan's family was devastated. A young and bright 16-year-old gone too soon, gone through no fault of her own. Her funeral was held on the 28th of September 2001, which was the day after what would have been Leanne's 17th birthday. After the sentencing, here's what Leanne Tiernan's mother, Sharon Hawkhead, said. "Although John Taylor has been locked up, our agony continues. We feel nothing for him. We are pleased that he has been locked up, so he can't do this to anyone else. But life should mean life. After such a heinous crime against a young and innocent girl, a monster like Taylor deserves nothing less than the maximum punishment by law. Thankfully, at least legally, he got what he deserved. His crime was so horrendous that True North Productions went on to make a television documentary about John Taylor. The 2003 documentary was called Killer in the Woods. It was produced and directed by Jess Fowle. John Taylor's behavior has had some resemblance to Jeffrey Dahmer in the sense that he was also fascinated by torturing animals. While Taylor enjoyed hunting them down and torturing them, Dahmer was oddly fascinated with dissecting them after their death. Seeing the monstrous route these criminals take in their adult life gives us ideas that some major red flags were missed in their childhood. A timely assessment of mental health is key if we're to reduce such instances where deranged criminals like Taylor and Dahmer take innocent lives for their own sadistic thrills. Thanks for tuning in to Twisted Minds. That was the case of John Taylor, and why don't you go ahead and click on one of the 2 videos on your screen for another one of our videos.